Tonight, before anything else, I want you to picture a stretch of blue water at the very end of a long summer day, somewhere on the edge of the world we now call Greece. The sea is calm and darkening, moving in slow, patient breaths against a shore of pale stones, and the light is going out of the sky very gently, the way it does in that part of the world, turning from gold to rose to a deep and quiet violet. There is an island out on the water, low and long and dry, with a scatter of olive trees on its hills, their leaves turning silver whenever the evening wind moves through them. On the shore there is a small harbour, and a few boats drawn up on the shingle, and a single fire burning near the water where someone is cooking fish. And the smoke of that fire rises straight up into the still air and drifts out over the sea. And all around this small and ordinary scene there is the enormous, patient silence of a land that has been lived in for a very, very long time. That is where we are going tonight. Not to one year, or one city, or one famous name, but across the whole long life of a people who lived on these shores and these islands, who quarrelled and sailed and built and dreamed here for thousands of years, and who, without ever quite meaning to, laid down so many of the ideas and the stories and the shapes of thought that the whole world would go on, using long after they themselves had turned to dust and olive shade. We are going to travel from the very beginning of it, from a time before there was any such thing as a Greek, all the way through to the slow evening of it, when the last of the old kingdoms passed quietly into other hands. It is a very long road, and there is no hurry at all. We have the whole night. So before we take a single step along it, let us first take care of you. Settle now into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight. Let the lamp grow dim, if there is a lamp. Let the screen grow dim. Let the small weight of the day, all the little things that were said and unsaid, all the tasks half done and the worries half formed, let all of it slip down from your shoulders, one quiet inch at a time, and pool on the floor beside you where you can leave it until morning. You do not need to carry any of it into the night. You do not need to follow the story closely. You do not need to remember a single name or date. My voice is only here to be a low and steady sound in the dark, a soft road for your mind to wander down until it wanders off the edge of waking altogether and into sleep, which is where I am hoping, very gently, to lead you. If you find that you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through the past, and only if you truly do, you might think about subscribing, because it does genuinely help these calm little films find the other people out there who are lying awake in the dark and looking for something soft to carry them off. And if you would like to, before your eyes close for good, you might leave your town and your local time down in the comments below. There is something quietly lovely in it, the thought of all of us scattered across the turning world, in 100 different hours and 100 different kinds of dark, all lying still and listening to the same old story of the same old sea. It helps other sleepless souls find their way here and find their way to rest. But if your eyes are already growing heavy, then do not trouble yourself with any of that. Just stay where you are and let me begin. Now, before there was a Greece, there was only the sea and the stone. Long before anyone spoke Greek, long before anyone had thought to draw a border around a place and give the place a name, there was simply this, a warm and restless sea, scattered all over with islands, from the great long island of Crete lying like a wall across the south, to the little dry rocks barely big enough for a single family and a single herd of goats. And around that sea there were coasts, folded and broken into 1,000 bays and headlands, so that nowhere in this whole world was ever very far from salt water, and nowhere was ever very far from a hill. It is a hard land, if you try to farm it the way you might farm a soft green valley in the north. The soil is thin and stony. The summers are long and dry and merciless, and the rivers shrink to threads of warm mud, and the sun presses down on the back of the neck like a flat warm hand that will not lift. But it is a land almost perfectly made for two things, and those two things would shape everything that came after. It is made for the olive and the vine, which love the stony ground and the long dry light and give back oil and wine, where wheat would only wither. And it is made for the sea, because the sea is everywhere, threading in and out between the islands, so that a person in a small boat, with a little courage and a fair wind, could hop from island to island across the whole of it, always with land in sight, always with a harbour somewhere ahead. So the people who came to live here became, almost without choosing to, people of the boat and the olive and the stony hill. They learned early that if their own little valley could not feed them, there was always another shore, just over the water, where a person might trade or settle or simply take what they wanted by force. And all of that, the thinness of the land and the nearness of the sea, would press upon them for thousands of years and slowly make them into what they became. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no need to hurry. Let us go right back to the very beginning, to a time so early that there is not yet anyone here at all worth the name of history, only small groups of people moving through the hills with their flocks, and the first faint smoke of the first small settlements rising here and there along the coasts. We are now somewhere around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, which is a length of time so vast that the mind cannot really hold it, so do not even try. Just let it be a very long time ago, longer ago than almost anything you have ever thought about, and let it stay soft and blurred at the edges the way the oldest things always are. In those first ages, the people here lived much as people lived in many other places at the same dim distance in time. They kept sheep and goats on the hills. They grew a little barley and a little wheat in the pockets of better soil. They made simple pots and simple tools of stone and bone, and they buried their dead with a little care, which is one of the oldest and gentlest signs we have that a group of people has begun to think of themselves as something more than animals moving through a landscape. For thousands of years almost nothing changed, or rather everything changed so slowly that no single person living through it would ever have noticed a change at all. A better kind of grain would spread from one valley to the next over the course of centuries. A new way of shaping a pot would drift across the islands like a rumour, generation by generation. The dead were buried, and their children grew, and their children's children, and the sea went on breathing against the shore exactly as it had before any of them were born, and exactly as it would long after the last of them was forgotten. And then, very slowly, on the great long island of Crete, lying across the warm southern sea, something began to gather itself together that had not been there before. It began, as these things usually begin, with a little more of everything. A little more grain than the people needed to eat, so that some could be stored against a bad year, and some could be traded away. A little more safety, because the island was large, and its shores were far from the troubles of the mainland. A little more skill, in the making of pots, and the weaving of cloth, and the working of soft bright metal. And where there is a little more of everything, there begins, sooner or later, to be someone whose task it is to gather it up, and count it, and keep it, and decide what is to be done with it. And around that person, over the long, slow years, there begins to grow a house, and then a larger house, and then something that is really no longer a house at all, but the first faint beginning of a palace. The people of Crete are the first people in this whole long story whom we can really begin to see, even a little, across the enormous distance of time, and because we did not know their name for themselves, we have given them one. We call them the Minoans, after a king named Minos who may or may not have ever lived, and who comes to us only through the much later stories of the Greeks, wrapped in myth and half in dream. But the people themselves were real, and what they built was real, and even now, when you stand among the pale broken stones of what they left behind, it is hard not to feel the warmth of them still rising off the ground. Their greatest place was a palace on a low hill a little way inland from the northern coast, at a spot we now call Knossos. And it was not a palace in the way we usually picture a palace, all towers and walls and grim defences. It was something stranger and gentler than that. It was a great sprawling honeycomb of a place, hundreds upon hundreds of rooms, all joined together around wide open courtyards where the light came flooding in, spreading outward across the hillside with no great wall around it and no need of one. There were storerooms deep in the cool heart of it, lined with rows of huge clay jars, each one taller than a man, filled with oil and wine and grain against the lean months and the bad years. There were workshops where craftsmen sat in the good light and worked soft gold into thin bright leaves, and carved seals no bigger than a thumbnail with tiny perfect pictures of bulls and octopuses and leaping fish. There were staircases that turned and dropped through several stories, lit by clever open shafts that carried the sun down into the lower rooms. And there were pipes of baked clay laid beneath the floors to carry clean water in and carry wastewater away, which is a comfort so quietly civilized that many people would go without it for thousands of years after the Minoans were gone. And on the walls, wherever the plaster was smooth, they painted. They painted with a lightness and a joy that still, after 3,500 years, seems to lift off the wall and dance. They painted dolphins turning through blue water, and lilies bending in the wind, and slender young men and women with long dark curls and huge dark eyes, walking in procession, carrying cups and flowers. And most famous of all, they painted the bull, and the astonishing thing that some of them seemed to have done with the bull, which was to run at it as it charged, and take it by the horns, and vault clean over its back in a long, slow curve of the body, landing lightly on the far side, as though gravity itself was something the Minoans had come to a private arrangement with. We do not really know what the bull leaping was, whether it was a sport or a rite or a test of courage, or a way of coming close to something the Minoans held sacred and dangerous. We only know that it mattered to them, because they painted it again and again, and shaped it in bronze and clay, and could not, it seems, quite leave it alone. And that is how the Minoans come to us, across all those years, not as warriors and not as conquerors, but as a bright, sea-loving, art-loving people, dancing with bulls and painting dolphins on their walls in the good clean light of their open courtyards, secure enough on their large island, and rich enough from their trade across the sea, that they seem never to have felt much need to build a wall or raise an army at all. They were traders above all. Their little ships went out from the harbours of Crete, in every direction across the eastern sea, carrying oil and wine and fine painted pots and delicate worked metal, and coming back laden with copper and tin and ivory and blue lapis and all the other good things of the wider world, from Egypt and from the coasts of the east. For a long span of centuries they were, as near as anyone was, the masters of that sea, not because they had conquered it with warships, but simply because they were the ones who knew it best and sailed it most. The ones whose boats you were most likely to meet on the water, and whose goods you were most likely to find in the market of any port from the mouth of the Nile to the shores of what is now Turkey. Later, much later, the Greeks would remember this dimly, and would tell stories of a mighty king named Minos, who ruled the waves and made all the islands pay him tribute. And though the stories were tangled up with monsters and mazes and doomed young lovers, at the bottom of them there was this real and quiet truth, that once, before the Greeks themselves were anyone at all, there had been a bright island people who ruled the sea with nothing but their boats and their skill. And beneath the great palace at Knossos, in the deep cool tangle of its lower storerooms and corridors, the later Greeks would place the darkest of their memories of Crete, the labyrinth, the maze so cunningly made that no one who went in could ever find the way out, and at the heart of it the Minotaur, the monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, to whom young men and women were sent as tribute to be devoured in the dark. It is one of the oldest and most haunting of all their stories, and it is worth sitting with for a moment tonight, softly, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your hand, because you can almost see how it grew. Imagine you are a simple herdsman from the poor and rugged mainland, and you come, perhaps once in your life, in a small boat across the water to trade at the great palace of Knossos. You have never in your life seen a building of more than one story, and now you are led in through a doorway into a place of hundreds of rooms, staircases dropping away into shadow, corridors turning and turning, storerooms deep underground, the whole vast honeycomb of it lit here and there with shafts of falling light, and everywhere on the walls the bull, the bull, the bull, painted and carved and worked in gold. You would be lost within a minute. You would feel the whole enormous cleverness of the place pressing in around you. And when you went home at last to your own small village of a dozen huts, and someone asked you what the great king's house had been like, what would you say? You would say it was a maze that no man could find his way out of, and you would say that the sign of the king was a great bull. And so, slowly over the centuries, out of wonder and out of a little fear and out of the long game of telling, the palace becomes the labyrinth, and the bull upon its walls becomes the monster at its heart, and a real and gentle and clever people leave behind them, as their shadow in the memory of others, a story of darkness and tribute, and a beast in the dark. That is how history so often turns into legend, not through lying, but through wonder, passed hand to hand down the long years until the plain truth of it is worn as smooth and strange as a pebble in a stream. But all of that lay far in the future, in the minds of a people not yet born. For now, in its own long afternoon of centuries, Minoan Crete simply flourished, bright and busy and unafraid. The first great civilization to arise on the soil of what would one day be the Greek world, though the Minoans themselves were almost certainly not Greeks at all, and spoke a language we still cannot read, written in a curling script we call Linear A that keeps its secrets to this hour. And then, as everything in this story eventually does, it began to end. The ending, when it came partly out of the ground itself, and partly out of the sea, and it began, as far as we can tell, with the mountain. For out in the water to the north of Crete there was an island, round and green and pleasant, with a fine town upon it and a busy harbour, an island the later Greeks would call Thera, and that island was not truly an island at all, but the top of a sleeping volcano, and one day, somewhere around 3,500 years ago, after who knows how many centuries of quiet, the mountain woke. The eruption of Thera was one of the largest that the world has known in all the long span of human memory. The whole heart of the island blew out into the sky in a column of ash and fire that must have been visible for hundreds of miles. And when the emptied mountain could no longer hold up its own weight, the centre of the island collapsed down into the sea, and the sea rushed in to fill the hole, and out of that violence came waves. Great walls of water that raced south across the open sea toward the northern coast of Crete, where the harbours and the boats and the busy little towns of the Minoans lay open and unguarded along the shore. We do not know exactly what those waves did, because the Minoans could not write us a letter about it, but we can guess. We can guess at harbours smashed and boats splintered, at the whole seafaring heart of a seafaring people broken in a single afternoon. And even for those who lived far enough inland to survive the water, the sky itself would have turned against them, for the ash of Thera drifted down over the fields and the olive groves, a cold grey snow in the warm summer, poisoning the land, ruining the harvest, blotting out the sun. A people whose whole life had been built on the sea, and the fruit of a fragile stony soil, had both of those things struck at once. And though the Minoans did not vanish all at once, though the palaces were patched and lived in for a while longer, something had gone out of them that never quite came back. The old confidence, the old unwalled ease, the sense of a people so safe and so rich that they never needed to lift a hand in war. And into that weakness, as always happens, others began to move. For while the Minoans had been dancing with their bulls on their large safe island, something new and harder had been growing up on the rugged mainland to the north, among the very people who had once come as poor herdsmen to gape at the great palace of Knossos. These were the Mysians, and they were, as far as we can tell, the first people in this whole long story who really were Greeks, who spoke an early form of the Greek tongue, the first faint ancestors of everyone who comes after in this tale. And they were nothing at all like the gentle Minoans. Where the Minoans built open sprawling palaces with no walls, the Mycenaeans built grim stone fortresses on high defensible hills, ringed with walls so massive that the later Greeks, gazing up at them, could not believe that mere men had raised them, and decided instead that they must have been built by giants, by the one-eyed Cyclopes, heaving the vast blocks into place with their monstrous hands. Where the Minoans painted dolphins and lilies and leaping dancers, the Mycenaeans painted warriors and hunts and chariots and files of armed men marching. Where the Minoans buried their dead simply, the Mycenaeans, at least their kings, were buried deep in stone-lined shafts and great beehive-shaped tombs, laid out with their bronze swords and their boar's tusk helmets. And over the faces of the greatest of them was placed a mask of beaten gold, so that even in the dark of the tomb the dead king wore the sun on his face. They were warriors and raiders and traders, hard and proud and hungry, organised under kings who ruled from their fortress palaces and kept, in careful clay tablets, minute records of everything they owned, every sheep and every sword and every jar of oil, and every man and woman who owed them work. And as the Minoans faltered after the disaster of Thera, the Mycenaeans crossed the water and took what the Minuans could no longer hold. They came to Crete and to Knossos itself, and there they settled into the old bright palace like hard new tenants, moving into a beautiful house built by someone gentler than themselves. And in the storerooms of Knossos, in its last age, the clay tablets are no longer written in the unreadable curling script of the Minuans, but in a new script which we call Linear B, and which, unlike the older writing, we can read. And when at last, after long labour, the tablets were read, they turned out to be written in Greek, an early, stiff, businesslike Greek, all inventories and lists, but Greek all the same. And so at that moment, reading over the shoulder of some long-dead Mycenaean clerk counting his master's sheep, we hear for the very first time in all of history the Greek language speak. It is not saying anything grand, it is only counting sheep and jars and swords. But it is Greek, and from this thin, dry thread of accountancy, the whole vast river of Greek words and Greek thought and Greek song will one day flow. The Mycenaeans, at their height, were a power to be reckoned with all across the Eastern Sea. Their fortresses studded the mainland, at Mycenae itself, rich in gold, and at Tiryns with its giant walls, and at Pylos by the Western Sea, and at many another high-strung place. Their traders and their raiders ranged far, and their name, it seems, was known and sometimes feared on distant shores. For in the records of other greater kingdoms of that age, in the letters of the Hittite kings of the East, there are mentions of a people from across the water, a restless, troublesome sea people, whom some scholars believe to be these very Mycenaean Greeks, meddling and raiding along the coasts of what is now Turkey. And it is out of this world, this hard, bright world of fortress kings and golden masks and long black ships drawn up on distant beaches, that there comes the greatest story the Greeks would ever tell about themselves, the story that they would carry in their hearts for the whole of the rest of their existence as a people, and that we carry still. It is the story of a war fought far across the sea, at a rich walled city on the coast of the east, a city called Troy. Whether there was ever truly a war at Troy, fought for the reasons the Greeks remembered, no one can say for certain. There was certainly a real city at the place the Greeks called Troy, a strong and wealthy city guarding the narrow strait between two seas, and that city was certainly burned, more than once, in the age of the Mycenaeans. And it is easy to see why such a place would draw the long black ships of hungry raider kings, sitting as it did astride one of the richest trade routes in the world. But whatever the plain truth of it, the Greeks remembered it as something far greater than a raid for plunder. They remembered it as the last and greatest gathering of the Age of Heroes, when the kings of all the Greek fortresses joined their ships and their men into one great fleet and sailed east to make war for 10 long years upon the towers of Troy. And they hung upon that memory everything they most admired and most feared in themselves, the rage of the greatest of their warriors, swift-footed and half-divine, who sulked in his tent while his friends died, because his honour had been slighted, and who came back to the fighting at last only out of grief and the wild wish for revenge. The old king of Troy, crossing the plain alone in the night to kneel before the man who had killed his son, and to kiss the hands, so he said, of the man who had killed his son, and to beg for the body back, so that it might be burned with honour. The doomed nobility of the Trojan prince who knew, going out to fight, that he would fall and that his city would fall with him, and that his wife would be led away into slavery, and his baby son thrown from the walls, and who went out to meet it anyway, because that was what a man was, in the hard bright reckoning of that age. All of this the Greeks would carry down the centuries in the two great poems they placed at the very head of their whole civilization, the two poems we still read, the tale of the rage of the hero and the long war, and the tale of the long wandering journey home of one clever and much enduring man after the war was won. But those poems were not written down in the age of the fortress kings themselves. They were composed and sung and remembered long afterward, looking back across a great gulf of darkness at a lost and golden age, because the world of the Mycenaeans, like the world of the Minoans before it, came to an end, and its ending was, if anything, even stranger and more complete, because when the Minoan world fell, we can at least point to the mountain and the wave. But when the Mycenaean world fell, and it fell all across the eastern sea at very nearly the same time, somewhere a little more than 3,000 years ago, we cannot point with any confidence to a single cause at all. We know only the result. All across that world, within the span of a few generations, the great fortresses were burned. Mycenae burned, and Tiryns and Pylos, whose last clay tablets, baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the palace, speak of watchers being sent down to guard the coast as though against some danger coming off the sea. And it was not only in Greece. All across the wider world of that age, kingdoms that had stood for centuries came crashing down together, one after another in what looks, from this great distance, like a single vast wave of collapse rolling across the whole eastern world. Great cities were burned and never rebuilt. Whole people seemed to have taken to their boats and their carts and gone wandering across the sea and the land in search of somewhere, anywhere, that still had bread. Trade routes that had carried tin and copper and gold for 1,000 years simply stopped. And behind it all we can only guess at the tangle of causes: drought perhaps, long and merciless, drying up the harvests year after year, earthquakes, shaking down the walls, the movements of desperate peoples, driven from their own ruined homes to fall upon the homes of others, and the slow inner rotting of kingdoms that had grown too rigid and too top-heavy, holding everything in the hands of a palace and a king, so that when the palace burned, everything it had been holding fell at once. Whatever the truth, the world went dark. And here we come to one of the quietest and strangest passages in the whole long story of the Greeks, a passage of several hundred years that we call, for want of anything better, the Dark Age, not because it was wicked, but because we can see so very little in it. When the palaces burned, the writing stopped. That stiff businesslike Greek of the clay tablets, that thin dry thread of accountancy that had been the first Greek voice we ever heard, simply fell silent, because it had only ever been the tool of the palace clerks, and when there were no more palaces, there were no more clerks, and no more need to write. And so the Greeks, having learnt to write, forgot how, and would not learn again for hundreds of years. The great fortresses stood empty, their giant walls slowly tumbling, until the people living in their shadow could no longer imagine that ordinary men had built them, and decided it must have been giants. The population fell and fell and fell again, until in some places there were only a few scattered families where once there had been busy towns. People went back to a simpler and a harder life, keeping their flocks, growing their barley, living in small villages of a few houses, ruled over by local strongmen who were kings of very little. And yet, and this is the gentle and important thing, they did not vanish. Through all those dark and silent centuries, on the poor and rugged land, in the small villages, by the small fires, the Greeks went quietly on being Greek. They kept their language, changed and simplified, but still the same tongue, still counting sheep and naming the sea. They kept their gods, the great family of the Sky Father and the Sea God and the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom and all the rest, quarrelling and loving and meddling on their high cold mountain, and above all, around those small fires in those small villages, through those long dark years, they kept their stories. For this was the great age of the singers, the wandering poets who went from hall to hall and fire to fire, carrying in their memory, with no written word to help them, the whole vast store of the old tales. The tales of the fortress kings and the golden age, of the war at Troy and the heroes who fought there. Night after night, in hall after hall, a singer would take up his lyre and begin, and out of his memory would come the old high words, the rage of the great warrior, the walls of Troy, the long black ships, the grief of the old king, and the people listening in the firelight would feel themselves lifted out of their small hard present and set down for a while in the golden past of their own people. And because these poems were sung and not written, they were never quite fixed, but grew and changed and deepened, generation by generation, singer by singer, each one adding a little, polishing a little, until the language of them had been worn as smooth and bright and perfect as a river stone. And then, at the very end of the Dark Age, when the Greeks at last learned to write again, some poet, or perhaps some school of poets, whom later ages would gather up under the single name of a blind singer, took that whole vast inherited store of song and shaped it, at last, into the two great poems, and someone, at last, wrote them down. And so the very first thing the Greeks did, the moment they could write again, was to reach back across the dark centuries and set down in permanent words the memory of the bright lost world that had gone before, the world of the fortress kings, so that everyone who came after would know where they had come from and who they had been. It is a very moving thing when you sit with it in the quiet of the night. The two poems that stand at the head of the whole of Greek literature, and through it at the head of so much of the literature of the whole Western world, are not poems of the present looking forward. They are poems of a broken people in a diminished age, looking back with love and longing at a greatness they had lost, and could barely imagine ever regaining. And out of that backward look, out of that grief and that longing, the Greeks began, slowly, to climb back up into the light. For as the Dark Age wore on toward its end, things very slowly began to grow again. The population which had fallen so far began to rise. The small villages grew a little larger and began here and there to knit themselves together. Trade crept back onto the sea, at first in the ships of others, the traders of the eastern coast, the great sailors and merchants whom the Greeks called the Phoenicians, who came from the cities of the far eastern shore and ranged all across the sea, buying and selling. And from those eastern traders the Greeks took, along with many goods, the single most valuable thing they would ever import, more valuable than all the tin and gold in all the ships that ever sailed. They took the alphabet, for the Phoenicians had a way of writing that was not like the clumsy old syllable signs of the vanished palace clerks, but something far simpler and more powerful, a small handful of letters, each one standing for a single sound that could be learned by an ordinary person in a matter of days, and could be used to write down anything at all that a human being could say. The Greeks took this gift, and they improved it, adding letters for the vowel sounds that the Eastern script had left out, and so they made, out of the borrowed Eastern signs, the first true alphabet, the ancestor of the very letters on the screen before you now, if you are reading and not only listening. And with that light and powerful new tool in their hands, a tool that any farmer or potter or sailor could learn, and not only the servants of a king, the Greeks stepped at last out of the long darkness and into the light of history. The age that now begins as the Greeks climbed up out of the darkness, we call the Archaic Age, which only means the old age, the age of beginnings, and it is the age in which almost everything that we think of as Greek was first put in place. And the very first and most important of all those things was a new shape for living together, a new kind of human community, which the Greeks called the polis, and which we usually translate, not quite rightly, as the city-state. To understand the polis, you must first let go of the picture of a great kingdom ruled by a distant king. The land of Greece, remember, is a land all broken up into little pockets, small plains ringed by hard mountains, islands scattered across the sea, each little valley cut off from the next by a wall of stone. And in each of those little pockets, as the Greeks climbed back toward the light, the scattered villagers drew together around some defensible hill and some patch of good farmland and some spring of fresh water, and made themselves into a single small community, a single polis, fiercely independent, fiercely proud, and usually fiercely suspicious of every other polis just over the mountains. A polis was rarely large. Most of them, if you counted every man, woman, child, and slave, held only a few thousand people, and even the very greatest of them, at the very height of their power, held only a few 100,000. You could walk across the whole territory of most of them in a single day. And yet each one thought of itself as a complete and sovereign world unto itself, with its own laws, its own gods and festivals, its own way of doing things, its own fierce local loyalty, so that a man was never simply a Greek in the way that we might be simply the citizen of some vast nation. He was an Athenian, or a Spartan, or a Corinthian, or a Theban, first and above all, and the little polis of his birth was the thing he loved, and served, and would die for. This was the great strength of the Greeks, and it was also, in the end, their great weakness, and we shall see both faces of it before the night is through. Its strength was that it made every citizen feel that the community was truly his own, that its affairs were his affairs, its glory his glory, its decisions in some real sense his decisions. And out of that intense involvement came an energy and an inventiveness that a subject bowing before a distant king could never have felt. Its weakness was that it left the Greeks forever divided against themselves, hundreds of tiny proud communities, quarrelling endlessly over strips of borderland and points of honour, never able, except in the very greatest emergencies and never for very long, to act together as one. But that lay ahead. In the archaic age the polis was young and growing, and the Greeks were bursting with a new energy, and there were far more of them now than their thin stony land could feed. And so they did what people of the boat and the sea have always done. They went looking for more land across the water. This is the great age of Greek colonization, when out from the crowded little cities of the homeland there went, year after year, boatloads of younger sons and landless men and restless spirits, sailing off to found new cities of their own on distant shores. They went west, in their hundreds, to the coasts of southern Italy and the great island of Sicily, planting cities so many and so rich that the whole region came to be called Greater Greece, more Greek in some ways than Greece itself. They went east and north, up through the narrow straits and out onto the shores of the great dark sea beyond, ringing its coasts with Greek towns. They went south to the edge of Egypt, and west along the coast of Africa, and even to the far coast of what is now France and Spain, where a little Greek colony was planted that would one day grow into a great French city by the sea. And everywhere they went, they carried the polis with them, the same fierce independence, the same gods, the same language, the same games, so that a traveller could sail from the coast of Spain to the shores of the dark eastern sea, and in 100 scattered cities along the way, hear his own tongue, and pray to his own gods, and feel, in a strange land, at home. For though they were divided into 100 quarrelling cities, the Greeks never quite forgot that they were, all of them, in some deeper way, one people. They spoke, for all their local differences, one language, and they drew a hard line between themselves, who spoke it, and all the other peoples of the world who did not, and whose speech sounded to Greek ears like a meaningless babble of bar bar bar, so that they called all such peoples, dismissively, the barbarians. They shared the same great family of gods, and the same tangled store of old stories about them. And above all they came together, all of them, from every quarrel and every corner of their scattered world, at certain great shared holy places, and at certain great shared festivals where the endless wars were, for a few sacred days laid down. The greatest of these shared places was a quiet valley in the western hills, sacred to the Skyfather, the king of the gods, a place called Olympia. And there, once every 4 years, in high summer, the Greeks held a festival of games in his honour, And to that festival came men from every Greek city in the whole wide scattered world, to run and wrestle and box and race their chariots and throw the discus and the javelin, and to strive with one another, not for money, but for nothing more than a wreath of wild olive leaves and the pure, bright, immortal glory of having been, for 4 years, the best in all the Greek world at what they did. And so that men could come to the games in safety across a land forever at war, a sacred truce was declared for the season of the festival, and for that little while the wars fell silent, and the roads were safe, and all the quarrelling children of Greece gathered in peace in the sacred valley to watch their finest run. They counted their very years by it, reckoning time in 4-year spans from one festival to the next, so deeply did it sit at the centre of their shared life. And it is a lovely thing, is it not, to think of, as you lie there in the dark, that out of all their endless fighting the Greeks made, every 4 years, this small green island of peace, and filled it with nothing but running and wrestling and the honouring of the gods, and that we, thousands of years later, having forgotten so much of them, remember and still keep, however changed, this one bright gift of theirs, the games. Now, among all the hundreds of little cities of the Greek world, 2 grew over the Archaic Age to overshadow all the rest, and they grew in 2 directions so opposite, and became 2 things so utterly unlike each other, that the whole later history of Greece can almost be told as the long quarrel between them. One of them lay in the south, in a wide plain ringed by high mountains, and its name was Sparta. The other lay to the north and east, on a plain running down to the sea, gathered around a great rock crowned with temples, and its name was Athens. And to understand everything that comes after, we must understand how strange and how different these 2 were. Sparta began much like any other Greek city, but at some point early in the Archaic Age it faced a problem, and the way it answered that problem set it on a path unlike any other city in the whole Greek world. The problem was simple. The Spartans, hungry for land like all the Greeks, had marched over their western mountains and conquered the wide, rich neighbouring land of Messenia and made its whole people into slaves, into serfs bound to the soil, whom the Spartans called the Helots. And so the Spartans found themselves a small people sitting on top of a much larger people whom they had enslaved and who hated them, and who outnumbered them many times over, and who waited always for any moment of Spartan weakness to rise up and cut their masters' throats. And the Spartans, faced with this danger that would never go away, made a terrible and total choice. They decided that they would become, every man of them, a soldier, and nothing but a soldier, for the whole of his life, so that they might hold down by sheer discipline and sheer readiness the vast enslaved population beneath them. And they bent every single thing about their society, from the cradle to the grave, toward that one iron purpose. A Spartan was a soldier from birth, and I mean truly from birth, for it is said that when a child was born it was brought before the elders of the city to be examined, and if it seemed weak or sickly it was not allowed to live. At 7 years old the boys were taken from their mothers and their homes and given over to the state, to be raised in hard packs and companies, underfed on purpose so that they would learn to steal and forage and endure hunger without complaint, given a single thin cloak for the whole year against both the summer heat and the winter cold, toughened and drilled and beaten, and set against one another in contests of endurance, taught to speak rarely and to speak briefly, so that to this day we call a few hard-cutting words spoken with grim brevity by the name of that region, laconic speech. They were taught to read and write only a little, just enough, and to sing the songs of war, and above all to obey, instantly and without question, and to fear nothing in the whole world so much as they feared shame, and to hold it the highest thing a man could do to die in the battle line with his wounds in front, and the lowest and most unbearable thing to throw away his shield and run. A Spartan mother, handing her son his shield as he went off to war, was remembered to have said to him the hardest 6 words in all of Greek history: "Come back with this, or upon it." Carrying his shield in victory, or carried home dead upon it, but never ever without it, having thrown it away in flight. And out of this iron and joyless upbringing the Spartans made themselves into the finest soldiers in the Greek world. Perhaps the finest heavy infantry the world had yet seen, a small band of grim professionals in a world of part-time farmer soldiers, and for a long time no one on a battlefield could stand against them. But the price of it was everything else. The Spartans made almost no art, and wrote almost no books, and built almost no great buildings, so that a later Greek writer noted with wonder that if the city of Sparta were ever to fall empty and be dug up by people in some far future age, they would never in the world be able to believe, from the poor scattered stones of it, that this had been one of the two great powers of Greece. The Spartans gave up wealth and comfort and beauty and art and trade and travel and freedom and privacy and family life, and almost everything that makes a human life rich and varied and their own, and they poured it all, every drop, into the single terrible perfection of the battle line. And now turn from Sparta and look at Athens, and you will see very nearly the opposite of all of this. Athens too faced hard problems as the archaic age went on, but they were not the problem of a conquered enslaved people, but the more ordinary and more universal problem of the poor and the rich. For as the city grew, the good land fell more and more into the hands of a few noble families, and the poor farmers, borrowing against their land and their labour in bad years, fell deeper and deeper into debt, until many of them had pledged their very bodies against their debts, and when they could not pay, were seized and sold into slavery, sold sometimes far across the sea, for the crime of being poor in a bad year. And the anger of the poor grew and grew, until the whole city stood on the very edge of a bloody civil war between those who had everything and those who had nothing. And at that moment, teetering on the edge of the abyss, the Athenians did something remarkable, something very Greek, something they would do again and again at the great turning points of their history. Instead of simply fighting it out, they agreed, rich and poor together, to hand the whole tangled, desperate mess over to a single wise man, a man both sides trusted, and to let him make new laws to set the city right, and to swear, all of them, to abide by whatever he decided. The man they chose was named Solon, and he was a poet and a traveller and a merchant and, above all, a man of deep and humane good sense, and what he did in his year of power laid one of the very first foundation stones of everything that Athens would become. He did not do what the poor wildly hoped, which was to seize all the land of the rich and share it out anew, but neither did he do what the rich wanted, which was to crush the poor and go on as before. He walked, instead, a hard middle road. He cancelled the crushing debts at a single stroke, and lifted the burdened stones from the mortgaged fields, and freed the men who had been enslaved for debt, and bought back, out of the city's own funds, those who had been sold across the sea, and brought them home. And then he made a law that no Athenian could ever again be enslaved for debt, that no citizen's body could ever again be pledged against what he owed, so that never again would an Athenian be sold into slavery merely for being poor. And he gave the city new laws, written down and set up in public, where every citizen could see them and know them, the same for rich and poor alike, so that justice would no longer be whatever the noble families said it was behind closed doors, but a known and public and equal thing. And most quietly and most importantly of all, he began, just a little, to open the doors of the city's government, so that it was no longer only the great noble families who had a voice in the running of Athens, but, in some small measure, the ordinary free men of the city too. He did not make Athens a democracy. That was still far off, but he cracked the door and let in the first thin line of light, and the Athenians never afterward forgot it. And then, his work done, Solon did the most extraordinary thing of all. Having been given, for a year, almost total power over the whole city, he laid it down and refused to become a tyrant, and made the Athenians swear to keep his laws for 10 years. And then he left the city altogether and went travelling for a decade, so that he could not be pressed day after day to change this law or bend that one, but the whole city would have to live with what he had made, and find out for itself that it was good. But the road from Solon's cracked door to the full daylight of democracy was neither short nor straight, and Athens had to pass first through a long spell of one-man rule. For in the years after Solon, an ambitious nobleman named Pisistratus, clever and charming and patient, seized power in the city and made himself its tyrant, which to Greek ears did not yet mean a cruel monster, but only a man who had taken sole power outside the law, and as tyrants went he was a mild and even a good one, who kept most of Solon's laws and lent seed and money to the poor farmers, and adorned the city with fine buildings and great festivals, and it is under him and his sons that the city truly began to grow rich and splendid. But a tyranny, however mild, sits always upon fear, and when Pisistratus died and his sons ruled after him, the rule grew harder and more suspicious, and one of the sons was murdered by two friends in a private quarrel that the Athenians later chose to remember, rightly or wrongly, as a blow struck for freedom, and after that the surviving son grew cruel indeed, and the city came to hate him. And at last, with a little help from Sparta, whose soldiers marched in and besieged the tyrant on the sacred rock, the last tyrant was driven out, and Athens was free of one-man rule forever. And it is now, in the confusion after the tyrant's fall, with the noble families once again scrambling for power among themselves, that the second great founder of Athenian freedom steps forward, a nobleman named Cleisthenes, who did something that no ambitious nobleman had ever quite done before. Locked in a struggle with his rivals for control of the city, and losing, he turned, for allies, not to other nobles, but to the ordinary people, to the whole mass of the common citizens, and he offered them, in exchange for their support, a share in power greater than any of them had ever dreamed of, and having won with their help, he kept his word, and remade the whole machinery of the city from the ground up, in a way so bold and so clever that it is fair to call him the true father of the democracy. He broke up the old power of the great families by mixing the whole citizen body together in a wholly new way, sorting them into new groups that cut clean across the old lines of clan and neighbourhood and wealth, so that a man's place in the city no longer depended on which great family he was born into, but only on the fact that he was a citizen. And he set at the heart of the city a great council, chosen by lot, chosen that is by drawing lots at random from among all the ordinary citizens, so that the running of the city passed into the hands not of the well-born or the rich or the clever, but of ordinary men, farmers and potters and shoemakers, taking their turn to govern and then handing it on to the next. And above the council he set the assembly, the gathering of all the citizens together in one place, on a bare hillside under the open sky, where any man who wished might stand up and speak, and where, at the end of the speaking, the whole people, by the raising of their hands, decided themselves directly the great questions of war and peace and law. This was something genuinely new under the sun. There had been kingdoms beyond counting, and empires and tyrannies, and rule by the few and the rich. But here, in this one small city on its plain by the sea, the ordinary free men gathered on a hillside and ruled themselves, made their own laws with their own raised hands, and bowed to no king and no council of the well-born, but only to one another and to the law they themselves had made. They called it democracy, which means, quite simply and quite literally, the power of the people, and it was as fragile and as quarrelsome and as imperfect as any human thing, and it left out, as we shall not forget, the women and the slaves and the many foreigners who lived among them, so that the number who truly ruled was only a fraction of all who lived in Athens. And yet, for all that, it was a wholly new idea about how human beings might live together, an idea that the ordinary person is fit to govern himself, and it was born here, on this hillside in this small city, and from here across all the centuries it has come down, battered and interrupted and reborn 100 times, to us. And it was scarcely born, this new and fragile Athenian freedom, this bold experiment in the power of the people, when it was put at once to the hardest possible test, for out of the east there now came, rolling toward the little quarrelling cities of Greece, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Far away to the east, While the Greeks had been building their little cities and colonizing their distant shores, a people called the Persians had risen, under a line of brilliant and ambitious kings, to build an empire beyond anything in the previous history of the world. It stretched from the edge of India in the east to the shores of the Greek Sea in the west, from the deserts of Egypt in the south to the cold plains of the north, and it held within it uncounted millions of people of 100 nations and 100 tongues, all bound together under the absolute rule of one man, the great king, the King of Kings, who sat in unimaginable splendour in his palaces of the east, and whose word was law from one end of the earth to the other. And to this King of Kings, ruling over half the known world, the little cities of Greece, if he thought of them at all, were the merest scattering of poor and quarrelsome towns on the far ragged western edge of things, hardly worth the trouble of a conqueror. But they had made themselves his trouble, for along the eastern coast of the Greek Sea, on the shores of what is now Turkey, there lay a string of old and wealthy Greek cities, and these had fallen over the years under the rule of the great king, and they chafed under it, and at last they rose in revolt against him. And when they rose, they sent west across the sea, to the free cities of the Greek homeland, begging for help against the king. And most of the homeland cities, wisely and cautiously, wanted nothing to do with it, for who in his right mind would poke the greatest empire on earth? But Athens, young and bold and proud of its new freedom, sent ships and sent men, and those men marched inland with the rebels and took part in the burning of one of the king's own regional capitals, before the revolt was at last crushed and the eastern cities beaten back down into submission. And far away in the east, the great king, hearing that some little city on the far edge of the world, some place called Athens that he had barely heard of, had dared to send men to burn one of his cities, is said to have asked who these Athenians even were, and then, being told, to have sworn a great oath of vengeance, and to have commanded one of his servants to stand behind him at dinner every single day and say to him 3 times, "Master, remember the Athenians." And so the storm gathered in the east, and began to move west toward the little city on the plain that had just, for the first time in the history of the world, dared to try to rule itself. The first blow fell across the sea in the form of a great fleet and a great army, sent west by the great king to punish Athens and the other city that had helped the rebels, and to bring the impudent little towns of Greece to heel. The Persian force crossed the sea from island to island, and landed at last on the coast of Attica, the land of the Athenians, on a wide flat plain beside a curving bay, a plain whose name has echoed down every century since, the plain of Marathon. And there the small army of Athens came out to meet them. The Athenians had sent a runner racing over the mountains to Sparta, to beg the finest soldiers in Greece to come and stand beside them, but the Spartans, bound by some rigid religious law that forbade them to march until the moon was full, sent word that they would come. But not yet, not for some days. And so the Athenians stood almost alone, a few thousand citizen soldiers, farmers and potters and shopkeepers who had left their fields and their workshops and taken down their spears and their heavy round shields from the wall, facing across the plain of Marathon an army that outnumbered them, an army of the greatest empire on earth. And they did not wait. Knowing that if they hesitated the city might be betrayed from within, and knowing that they could not stand a long siege, the Athenians did the thing that no one expected, the thing that seemed like madness. They charged. Across the whole width of the plain, at a run, in their heavy armour under the arrows of the Persian archers, the whole line of Athenian citizens came on at a dead run, and crashed into the Persian host with a shock that the enemy could not withstand. The Persians were brave, and they were many, and in the centre they held, and even pushed the thin Athenian middle back. But the Athenians had made their wings strong and deep, and on both wings they broke the Persians and drove them back, and then, instead of chasing the fleeing enemy, they wheeled inward, both wings turning together upon the Persian centre, and caught it between them, and crushed it, and drove the whole vast army in a screaming rout back across the plain and into the sea and the marshes, back toward their ships. And when the long day was over, there lay upon the plain of Marathon, by the count the Athenians made, more than 6,000 of the enemy dead, and of the Athenians themselves, 192. 192 men, and no more, and the whole vast host of the great king thrown back into the sea by a single small city, fighting almost alone. The Athenians buried their 192 dead beneath a great mound of earth there on the plain where they had fallen, and that mound still stands today, a low green hill in a quiet field, and men still go there to stand upon it in the silence and think about that day. And a story grew up, which may not be true but which is too lovely to leave out on a quiet night such as this, that a single runner was sent racing from the battlefield back to the city to carry the news before the people should despair, and that he ran the whole long way without stopping, in his armour, under the hot sun, over the dusty road, and staggered at last into the marketplace of Athens, where the old men and the women and the children waited in terror for word of whether they were free or doomed, and that he had breath enough left for one single word, "We have won," and then fell dead upon the stones, having spent his whole life in that one run and that one word. And from that run, real or not, comes the long race that men and women still run to this day, in every country of the world, and still call by the name of that flat plain by the sea, where the citizens of a free city once charged an empire and won. But Marathon was only the first blow, and the empire was patient and vast, and it did not forget. 10 years passed, and the old great king died, and his son came to the throne, a proud and mighty king, and he swore to finish what his father had begun, and this time not to send a mere expedition, but to come himself, at the head of the whole gathered strength of his boundless empire, and to blot the insolent Greeks off the face of the earth altogether. For years the whole East laboured to make ready. From every one of the 100 nations of the empire the soldiers were summoned, until there was gathered such an army as the world had never seen. So vast that the Greeks, trying afterward to reckon its size, threw up their hands and spoke of millions, of an army that drank the rivers dry as it passed, of a host so great it took 7 days and 7 nights to cross a single bridge. And the numbers the Greeks gave are surely far too large, the honest exaggerations of terrified men, but the truth behind them is real enough, that there was coming against the little cities of Greece an army and a fleet greater than anything in the memory of the world, and that the Greeks, looking east, had every earthly reason to believe that they were about to be swept away. The great king bridged the very strait that divided Asia from Europe, lashing hundreds of ships together side by side across the water and laying a road upon their backs, so that his army might march dry-shod from one continent to the other, and when a storm rose and smashed the first bridge, it is said that the king in his fury commanded that the sea itself be whipped, 300 lashes, for daring to break what the King of Kings had built. And then, across the mended bridge, the great host came pouring into Europe and turned south, and began to roll down through the north of Greece toward the little cities of the south, gathering the submission of the northern peoples as it came, and it seemed that nothing in the whole world could stand against it. Now at last, in the face of this, the Greeks did the thing they could almost never do. Faced with the certain end of everything, some of them, though by no means all, set aside their endless quarrels and came together. Representatives of the cities that would resist met and swore to stand as one, and to end their wars with one another for the duration, and even, most painfully of all, to give the supreme command on land and on sea to Sparta, because the Spartans were the finest soldiers, and the others swallowed their pride and agreed. But many Greek cities did not join. Some had already submitted to the king, sending him earth and water, the tokens of surrender, rather than be destroyed. Some stood coldly aside to see which way the wind would blow, and so it was only a league of the willing, a fraction of all the Greeks, who now moved north to try to hold back the flood, and their first plan was to hold the king's vast army at a place where its vast numbers would not help it, a narrow gap between the mountains and the sea, a pass so tight that only a handful of men could pass through it side by side, a place called the Hot Gates, which in Greek is Thermopylae. To hold the narrow pass at Thermopylae there marched north a small force gathered from many of the willing cities, and at its head, in command, went a king of Sparta named Leonidas, with a personal guard of 300 Spartans, 300 picked men, every one of them the father of living sons, so that no Spartan house would be wholly ended if they did not return. And they did not expect to return. There was an oracle, a prophecy, that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die, and Leonidas seems to have marched north already knowing, in his grim Spartan way, which of those two it was to be. At the narrow pass, with the cliffs rising on one side and the sea on the other, the small Greek force set itself across the gap, and there for 2 long days they held. Wave after wave the great king sent his soldiers into the narrow place, and in the narrow place their numbers were worth nothing, for only a few could come at the Greeks at once, and those few met the long spears and the great shields and the iron discipline of men who had trained for war their whole lives, and they died, and were replaced and died again, until the pass was choked with the fallen and still the Greeks held. Even the king's own personal guard, his finest and most feared troops, were flung into the gap, and even they could not break through. And it is said that the king, watching from his high seat, leapt to his feet 3 times in fear for his army, as the flower of his host broke again and again upon that thin unyielding line of Greeks. For 2 days the impossible held, and then, as it so often does in this world, it was betrayal that did what the whole strength of an empire could not. A local man, for the promise of the king's gold, came by night to the Persian camp and told the king of a secret path, a goat track through the mountains, that led up and over and around behind the pass, so that the king might send men along it in the night and take the Greeks from the rear. And in the grey before dawn, Leonidas learned that the path was betrayed, that even now the enemy was coming down behind him, and that the pass could no longer be held. And so he made his last choice. He sent away the greater part of the army, all the men of the other cities, sent them south to live and to fight another day, for there was no sense now in their dying. But he himself, with his 300 Spartans, and a few others who would not leave, stayed. For a Spartan did not retreat, and a Spartan did not abandon his post, and the law of his city, which he had obeyed his whole life, said that he must stand in the line where he had been set, and hold it or die, and so he would hold it, and die. On the last morning, knowing they were all to fall before the sun was high, the Spartans are said to have combed their long hair with great care, as they always did before a battle, and when a man ran to them crying that the Persian arrows were so many they would darken the sun, one of the Spartans answered, in the dry hard Spartan way, "Then we shall fight in the shade." And they went out beyond the wall, into the wide part of the pass, to sell their lives as dearly as they could, and they fought until their spears were shattered, and then they fought with their swords. And when their swords were gone, they fought with their hands and their teeth, until the last of them was buried under the arrows and the spears of the whole Persian host. And Leonidas the king lay dead among his 300, every one of them fallen at his post, exactly as the law of Sparta required. And afterward, over their bones, the Greeks raised a stone, and on the stone they carved words that are still, after all these centuries, almost unbearable in their plainness. Words that ask the passing traveller to carry a message home, "Go tell the Spartans, you who pass us by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." They had not saved Greece at Thermopylae. The pass was lost, and the road to the south lay open, and the great host poured through down into the heart of Greece and on toward Athens itself. And the Athenians now faced the most terrible choice a people can face, for their city lay directly in the path of the flood, and they could not hope to hold its walls against such a host. And here the story turns upon one man, an Athenian named Themistocles, as clever and as far-seeing a man as that clever city ever produced, who had understood, years before, a thing that most of his fellow citizens had not. He had understood that the future belonged to the sea. Some years earlier, when a rich new vein of silver had been struck in the mines that belonged to the city, and the citizens had been all for sharing the windfall out among themselves, a little pot of money for every man, Themistocles had argued, and at last persuaded them to do something far harder and far wiser, to take that silver and pour it, all of it, into building a great fleet of warships, the swift and deadly oared galleys that the Greeks called triremes. And so, when the great crisis came, Athens, almost alone among the cities of old Greece, had a mighty fleet. And now Themistocles made his argument, the hardest argument of all. He stood up in the assembly and told his fellow citizens that they must abandon their city, that they must put their faith not in their walls, which could not be held, but in their ships, which could. That they must carry their old men and their women and their children across the water to safety on the nearby islands and coasts, and that every man who could fight must go aboard the fleet, and that the city, the actual city, the houses and the temples and the streets where they had all been born, must be given up to the enemy to be burned. It was almost too much to ask, to abandon the sacred rock, the temples of the gods, the graves of the fathers. But there was a famous oracle, dark and doubtful as oracles always were, which had told the Athenians that they would be saved by a wall of wood. And while some argued that this meant they should barricade the sacred rock behind a wooden palisade and hold it, Themistocles argued that the wall of wood was the fleet, the wooden ships, and that the god was telling them to trust the sea. And the Athenians in the end believed him. And so they did the almost unimaginable thing. They emptied their city. They led their weeping families down to the boats and carried them away across the water, and the men went aboard the fleet, and behind them they left their homes standing empty and silent. And the Persian host came down upon Athens, and found it deserted, and burned it, and cast down the temples on the sacred rock, and the Athenians, from the decks of their ships out on the water, watched the smoke of their own burning city rise into the sky, and set their teeth and waited. The whole Greek fleet had gathered in a narrow strait of water between the mainland and a rocky island called Salamis, close by the burning city, and there the Greek captains fell to quarrelling, as Greeks always did, for many of them wished to sail away and defend their own homes. And only Themistocles saw that if the fleet scattered, all was lost, and that their one hope lay in fighting here, in the narrow water, where the vast Persian fleet would be crowded and cramped and unable to bring its great numbers to bear. And when he could not win the argument by persuasion, he won it, it is said, by a trick worthy of the cleverest man in Greece. He sent a secret message to the great king, pretending to be a traitor, pretending to betray his own side, and told the king that the Greeks were about to flee, and that if he wished to destroy them he must block both ends of the strait at once, that very night, and trap them. And the king, believing it, did exactly that, and sent his ships to seal the Greeks in, so that when the Greek captains woke in the morning still quarrelling about whether to flee, they found that they could not flee, that the enemy had bottled them into the narrow water in the night, and that now they had no choice at all but to turn and fight, which was exactly what Themistocles had wanted all along. And in the narrow strait of Salamis, that morning, everything that Themistocles had foreseen came true. The huge Persian fleet came crowding into the narrow water, ship packed against ship, unable to turn, unable to manoeuvre, fouling one another's oars, and into that helpless crush the Greek ships drove, ramming and shattering, and the great king, who had set up a golden throne on a hill on the shore, to watch in comfort as his fleet destroyed the last of the Greeks, watched instead. Hour after hour, as his own great fleet was broken and sunk and scattered before his eyes in the narrow bloody water, unable to do anything at all to save it. And when that long day ended, the sea power of the empire lay wrecked and drowned in the strait, and the great king, shaken to his soul, and afraid now of being trapped in Europe with his bridge broken behind him, turned and took the road home to the east, leaving his army behind under a general to finish the war the next year. And the next year the Greeks finished it. On land at a place called Plataea, the largest Greek army ever yet gathered, with the Spartans at last present in their full strength and fighting with all their terrible skill, met the great land army the king had left behind, and broke it utterly, and destroyed it, so that of the vast host that had come to swallow Greece, only a broken remnant ever struggled home to the east. And on that same day, or so the Greeks loved to believe, far across the sea, the last of the Persian fleet was caught and burned on a distant beach, so that on a single day the war was won on both the land and the sea, and Greece was free. Take a moment now, in the quiet, to feel the strangeness and the wonder of what had happened, for it truly is one of the most astonishing things in all of history. The greatest empire the world had ever known, holding half the earth and uncounted millions of subjects, had come with all its might to swallow up a scatter of small, poor, quarrelling towns on the far edge of the world. Towns that could not even agree among themselves, that fought one another as bitterly as they fought the enemy, that between them could field only a fraction of the men the king could summon with a wave of his hand. And the small, poor, quarrelling towns had won. Freedom, it turned out, was worth something on a battlefield. The citizen who fought for his own city, for his own laws that he himself had made, for his own home and his own family and his own vote in his own assembly, fought, it turned out, with a fire that the king's conscripts, driven forward under the lash to fight for a master they had never seen, could not match. The Greeks drew that lesson deep into their hearts, and it became one of the great ideas they gave the world. This idea that free men fighting for their own freedom are worth more than any host of slaves, however vast. And out of the immense pride and confidence and relief of that victory, out of the sheer astonished joy of having faced the end of the world and turned it back, there came, in the years that followed, in one small city above all, such an explosion of human genius as the world had rarely seen before and has rarely seen since. For the city that led that explosion was Athens, and the 50 years or so that followed the great victory were the years that we call, and rightly, the Golden Age. Athens came out of the war changed, and risen, and full of a boundless energy. The city that had been burned to the ground was rebuilt, and rebuilt more splendid than before. And Athens had a fleet, the greatest fleet in Greece, and with that fleet it now took the lead in the continuing war to drive the Persians back, and to free the Greek cities of the islands and the eastern coast that were still under the king's hand. The many cities that joined Athens in this work banded together into a great league, a league of free cities pledged to fight on together against the empire, and each city put into the common effort either ships or, if it had no ships, money, silver, paid year by year into a common treasury to build and man the fleet. And Athens, with its great navy, led the league, and the league, under Athenian leadership, won victory after victory, and cleared the sea and freed the cities until the long war with Persia at last guttered out. But here is where the story darkens, quietly, the way a bright afternoon darkens so slowly toward evening that you do not notice the light going until it is nearly gone. For the League did not disband when the war was won. The money kept being paid. And slowly, year by year, so gradually that it was hard to say just when it happened, the League of Free and Equal Cities became something else. It became an empire, the Empire of Athens. And the other cities became not allies but subjects, and the silver they paid became not their fair share of a common defence, but tribute paid to a master. When a city tried to leave the League, as some did, having noticed that the war they had joined to fight was over, Athens sent its fleet and its soldiers and forced them to stay, and pulled down their walls, and took their ships, and made them subjects indeed. And at last the Athenians moved the common treasury of the League, all that silver paid in by all those cities, from the island shrine where it had lain, home to Athens itself, and began, quite openly, to spend it, not on ships and war, but on themselves, on beautifying their own city, on raising, on the sacred rock above Athens, on the very rock the Persians had burned, the most perfect and famous buildings in the history of the world. The man who led Athens through these golden years, who guided the building and shaped the policy and dominated the assembly year after year by the sheer force of his mind and his character, was a nobleman named Pericles, and he gave his name to the age, so that we call it still the Age of Pericles. He was not a king, and he was not a tyrant. He held no power at all, except the power that the people gave him, year by year, by electing him again and again to high office, and by choosing, again and again, to follow his advice when he stood up to speak in the assembly. He ruled Athens, one ancient writer said, more truly than any king, and yet he ruled it entirely through the free choice of free men, who could have turned him out at any moment and who sometimes did. And under his long leadership, Athens became the most brilliant place in the world. It was Pericles who took the tribute of the empire and used it to raise, upon the burned rock above the city, the great temple to the city's own goddess, the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom, the temple we call the Parthenon, whose broken columns still stand upon that rock today, and are still, after all these centuries, perhaps the most perfect building that human beings have ever made. It was built of gleaming white marble, quarried from a mountain nearby and dragged up to the sacred rock, and it was shaped with a subtlety so fine that there is scarcely a truly straight line in the whole of it. For the builders had understood that a perfectly straight column looks, to the human eye, as though it sags in the middle, and so they made every column swell very slightly outward, and lean very slightly inward, and set the whole floor rising in a gentle curve, all so cunningly that the eye, deceived, sees only a perfect, soaring, impossible straightness. They built for the eye and the soul, not for the ruler, and they poured into that white temple on the rock all the pride and the genius and the confidence of the freest and cleverest city in the world. But the buildings, for all their glory, are the least of what Athens made in those years. For this small city, in this short span of years, with a free population smaller than that of many an ordinary modern town, brought forth such a crowd of the greatest minds in the whole history of the human race that it takes the breath away merely to list them. It was here, in these years, that the art of the theatre was born, and brought at a single bound to a height it has rarely reached since. The Athenians gathered, many thousands of them at a time, on the slope below the sacred rock, in the open air, under the sky, to watch plays performed in honour of the god of wine and of the theatre. And the plays they watched were not light entertainments, but vast and searching dramas that took the old myths, the old stories of the heroes and the gods, and used them to ask the deepest and hardest questions that a human being can ask. What do we owe to the state, and what to our own conscience, when the two collide? Can a man escape the doom that was laid on him before he was born? Is it right to answer one killing with another? And where, in that chain of blood, can it ever end, and how can mercy ever break in? Night after night, the whole city sat together in the open air and watched these terrible and beautiful stories unfold, and wept and thought, and went home changed. And beside the tragedies they made comedies too, wild and savage and gloriously rude, that mocked the leading men of the city by name, that made fun of the generals and the politicians and even the gods, so freely and so fearlessly that no city on earth has ever quite matched it. For in the free assembly of Athens even the greatest man could be laughed at to his face before the whole people, and had to bear it. And it was here, in these same years, and in the years that followed, that there was born the thing that may in the end be the greatest of all the gifts the Greeks gave the world. Greater even than the theatre, or the temple, or the vote, the thing we call philosophy, which means, quite simply, the love of wisdom. Long before, in the eastern Greek cities, certain bold and lonely thinkers had begun, for the first time in the history of the world as far as we know, to ask a wholly new kind of question about the world around them. For in every land and every age before them, when people asked why the world was as it was, why the sun crossed the sky and the rivers flowed and the crops grew and the storms came, they had answered with the gods. The sun was a god, or was driven by a god. The storm was the anger of a god. Everything that happened because some unseen person, some spirit or god, willed it so. But these lonely Eastern Greeks began to ask a different question. They began to ask whether the world might not run, not on the whims of unseen persons, but on its own, by rules of its own, rules that a human mind might hope to understand. They began to ask what the world was really made of, underneath all its changing shapes, and to guess variously that it was all water, or all air, or all fire, or made of tiny pieces too small to see, so small that they could never be cut into anything smaller. Pieces they called, in Greek, the uncuttable things, the atoms. They were often wrong, gloriously and wildly wrong, in the details. But in the great thing they were right, and their rightness changed the world forever, for they had grasped, first among all peoples, the tremendous idea that the universe is not a nursery of quarrelling gods, but an ordered thing that runs by understandable rules, and that the human mind, by looking hard and thinking clearly, can hope to understand it. That single idea is the seed of all the science that would ever come after. All of it. Every discovery and every machine and every cure, down to the very screen or speaker through which my voice is reaching you now in the dark. All of it began here, with a handful of Greeks by the Eastern Sea, daring to wonder whether the world made sense. But we should not run too far ahead into the cool, clear air of philosophy, without pausing to remember the warmer and older world that the ordinary Greek actually lived in, day by day. All through these centuries, for the great thinkers were always a small handful, and around them, filling the cities and the fields and the marketplaces, were the ordinary people. And the ordinary people lived, from the cradle to the grave, in the company of their gods. And the gods of the Greeks were like no gods before or since, for they were not distant and perfect and terrible, but near, and flawed and gloriously exasperatingly human. They lived, the Greeks imagined, on the top of the highest mountain in the land, hidden in the clouds, a great quarrelsome family of them, ruled over by the Sky-Father, the Lord of the Thunder, who was forever falling in love with mortal women and forever being scolded for it by his jealous queen. There was his brother, the Dark Lord of the Sea, who shook the earth and drowned the ships of men who angered him. There was the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom and of clever craft, born, they said, straight from her father's head, who loved the city of Athens above all others and gave it her name and her olive tree. There was the golden god of the sun, and of music, and of prophecy, and his wild sister the huntress of the moonlit woods, and the limping smith of the gods who forged the thunderbolts in his fiery workshop under the mountains, and the goddess of love, born from the foam of the sea, whose smile could undo the wisdom of the wisest man alive, and the swift messenger with the winged sandals, and the grim lord of the dead in his sunless kingdom under the earth, and many, many more. And these gods were not good. Not in the way we might expect gods to be good. They lied, and quarrelled, and took revenge, and played favourites, and fell in love, and grew jealous, and behaved in short exactly like human beings, only larger, and deathless, and armed with terrible power. And the Greeks did not, on the whole, love their gods, or feel loved by them, in the way that later peoples would feel toward their god. They feared them, and honoured them, and tried to keep on the right side of them, for the gods were proud and easily offended and quick to punish any mortal who forgot to give them their due, or who grew too great or too proud, and dared to think himself the equal of a god, for that above all the gods would not endure. And the man who climbed too high, who forgot that he was mortal and small, was always, in the end, struck down. And the Greeks had a word for that overreaching pride that goes before a fall, and it is a word we use still. So the ordinary Greek lived his life hedged all about with small acts of worship and remembrance, a splash of wine poured out upon the ground for the gods before he drank, a prayer at the little shrine by the door, a sacrifice at the great festivals when a fine beast was killed upon the altar, and the smoke of it sent up to please the gods while the people feasted on the meat. For even the gods, the Greeks felt, must be given their share, and then would leave you perhaps in peace. And above all, when a Greek faced some great and doubtful choice. When a city wondered whether to go to war, or a man whether to make a voyage or a marriage, they would go, if they could, to ask the gods directly, at one of the great oracles, the holy places where, it was believed, the gods would answer the questions of mortals. And the greatest and most famous of all these oracles lay in the mountains of the mainland, at a place called Delphi. Clinging to a steep hillside beneath grey cliffs, a place so beautiful and so strange that the Greeks believed it to be the very centre of the whole world. There, in the temple of the golden god of prophecy, a priestess sat above a cleft in the rock, from which it was said strange vapours rose, and breathing them she would fall into a kind of trance, and speak. And her wild and broken words were taken as the voice of the god himself, and shaped by the priests into answers, and given to those who had come, often from very far away, to ask. But the answers of Delphi were famously dark and double-edged, riddles that could be read two ways, so that the god was never quite wrong whatever happened. There is a famous story of a rich and mighty king from the east who sent to Delphi to ask whether he should make war upon the great empire of Persia, and the oracle answered that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. And so, delighted, he went to war, and he did indeed destroy a great empire. Only the empire he destroyed was his own, for he was crushed, and his kingdom taken. And when he sent bitterly to Delphi to reproach the god replied that he had spoken perfectly truly, and that the king had only himself to blame for not asking which empire he meant. And carved upon the temple at Delphi, for every pilgrim to read as he climbed to ask his anxious question, were two short sayings, two little scraps of the deepest wisdom the Greeks ever reached. And they are worth carrying with you into sleep tonight, for they have lost nothing of their truth in all the centuries between. The first was simply this: know yourself. And the second was this: nothing too much. Know yourself, and nothing in excess. In those few words, carved on that mountain temple, is folded up so much of what the Greeks understood about how a human being might live wisely and well, that we must look honestly and clearly at what we truly are, neither more nor less, remembering always that we are mortal and fallible and small, and that the good life is a life of balance and moderation, of nothing carried to excess, not even virtue, not even wisdom, but all things held in a fair and gentle measure. It was against the background of all this, the crowded quarrelsome family of the gods upon the mountain, the smoke of the sacrifices, the dark riddles of the oracle, the deep old fear of overreaching pride, that the new philosophy grew up. And you can see now why it was such a strange and daring and even dangerous thing. For when the philosophers began to ask whether the world might run by understandable laws rather than by the will of the gods, and when men like Socrates began to question everything, to hold every belief up to the cold, clear light of reason and ask whether it made sense, there were always those who felt that this questioning was itself a kind of impiety, a kind of overreaching, a forgetting of the proper smallness and humility of a mortal before the gods. And that old tension between the ancient warm world of the gods and the festivals and the new cold, clear world of reason and question ran right through the heart of Greek life, and it was into that tension, in the end, that Socrates would fall, an old man tried by his own city for not believing in its gods, and for teaching the young to question, put to death, in part, because the questioning mind he stood for frightened those who wished to keep the old certainties undisturbed. So the ordinary Greek and the extraordinary philosopher lived side by side in the same bright cities, the one pouring his wine out to the gods at his doorway, the other asking, in the marketplace, what any of it truly meant, and both of them, the worshipper and the questioner, are part of the whole rich human truth of what the Greeks were. And in Athens, in the golden years and the harder years that followed them, philosophy turned from asking what the world is made of to asking a question closer to home and harder still, how a human being ought to live. And the man whose name stands at the head of that turning, one of the strangest and most unforgettable people in the whole of history, was an ugly, barefoot, poor old stonemason named Socrates, who wrote not a single word in his whole life, and who yet changed the course of human thought as few writers ever have. Socrates spent his days wandering the marketplace and the streets of Athens, falling into conversation with anyone who would talk to him, the young and the old, the famous and the humble, and asking them questions. That was all he did. He asked questions. But his questions were like nothing anyone had heard before, for he would take some great word that everyone used and everyone thought they understood, a word like justice, or courage, or goodness, or piety, and he would ask, with perfect innocence, what it actually meant, and the person he was talking to would give a confident answer, and Socrates would gently ask another question, and then another, and slowly, patiently, without ever once raising his voice or claiming to know the answer himself, he would lead the confident man to see that he did not really understand the thing he had been so sure of, that his fine ideas fell apart the moment they were looked at closely, that he had been living his whole life using words whose meaning he had never truly examined. Socrates claimed to know nothing himself, nothing at all, and said that if he was in any way wiser than other men, it was only in this, that other men did not know, and did not know that they did not know, whereas he did not know either, but at least knew that he did not know, and he held with his whole soul that the unexamined life, the life lived without ever stopping to ask what any of it means and whether we are living rightly, was not worth living for a human being, and that the greatest thing a person could do was to care for the goodness of his own soul above all the wealth and power and reputation in the world. He was loved, and he was also, by many, hated, for it is an uncomfortable thing to be shown, in front of others, that you do not understand your own most confident beliefs, and Socrates made powerful enemies among the important men whose ignorance he had gently exposed. And in the end, when Athens had fallen on hard and bitter and frightened times, those enemies had their revenge, and Socrates was put on trial before a great jury of his fellow citizens, charged with not believing in the gods of the city, and with corrupting the young men whose minds he had taught to question everything. He could have saved himself easily. He could have begged, or wept, or offered to stop his questioning and live out his days in silence, or simply slipped quietly away into exile, as everyone rather expected him to do, and as his friends later all but arranged for him to do. But he would not. He stood before the jury and told them, in effect, that he had done nothing wrong, that he had spent his life trying to make his fellow citizens better, and that he would not stop philosophizing to save his life, because a life without it was not to him a life at all, and the jury, angered by his refusal to grovel, condemned him to death by a narrow vote, and sentenced him to drink a cup of poison. And even then his friends made everything ready for him to escape from prison and flee the city, and begged him to go, and he refused again, because he had lived his whole life as a citizen under the laws of Athens, and enjoyed their protection. And he would not now, when those same laws had turned against him, break them merely to save his own skin, for that, he said, would make a mockery of everything he had ever taught. And so, on his last day, surrounded by his weeping friends, calm and even cheerful, still talking, still questioning, still reasoning about the soul and whether it might outlive the body, he waited until the sun was near setting, and then he drank the poison and lay down and died. And in dying as he had lived, faithful to the very end to the one thing he believed above all, that a human being must care first for the goodness of his soul, Socrates became something more than a man, became a kind of pattern, held up ever after, of what it might mean to live and to die for the truth. And the greatest of the young men who had followed him, a nobleman named Plato, was so shaken by the death of his master, so haunted by the spectacle of the wisest and best man he had ever known being put to death by his own city, that he devoted the whole of the rest of his long life to writing down, and building upon, and carrying forward the questions that Socrates had asked, until he had raised upon them one of the vastest and most beautiful structures of thought that any single human mind has ever made. And Plato in his turn taught a young man of extraordinary gifts, a young man named Aristotle, who would go on to become perhaps the widest-ranging mind in the whole of human history. A man who tried, quite simply, to understand and to organize everything, who wrote on the stars and the animals and the weather and the soul, on poetry and on politics, on friendship and on happiness, on how we reason and how we ought to live, and whose thought would come to dominate the mind of the Western world for the better part of 2,000 years. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, teacher and pupil in turn, 3 generations in one small city, and among them they laid down the foundations of nearly the whole of Western philosophy, so that a great thinker of a much later age would say, only half in jest, that all the philosophy that came after them was merely a series of footnotes to what they had begun. And all of it, remember, all of this glory, the temple and the theatre and the philosophy, was happening in a single small city. In a single short span of years, a city you could have walked across in a morning. A city of a few tens of thousands of free citizens, quarrelling in their assembly, trading in their marketplace, sailing their ships, and somehow, in the middle of it all, giving birth to so much of the mind of the world. It could not last. Nothing so bright ever lasts. And even in the golden years, the shadow was already lengthening, for the very greatness of Athens, its wealth, its fleet, its empire, its overwhelming pride, was becoming unbearable to the other great power of Greece, the grim and watchful power in the south, and Sparta and its allies looked at the growing empire of Athens with a fear and a jealousy that swelled year by year toward war. The war, when it came, was the great tragedy of the Greek world, a long and terrible war between the two greatest cities of Greece and all the lesser cities they drew in on either side. A war that dragged on, with a few uneasy pauses, for a whole generation, for 27 years, and that bled the strength of Greece so white that in a way it never truly recovered. We call it the Peloponnesian War, after the great southern peninsula where Sparta and most of its allies lay, and it was at bottom a war between an elephant and a whale, between the greatest land power in Greece and the greatest sea power, each supreme in its own element and unable to come fully to grips with the other. Sparta and its allies could march into the lands of Athens and burn the farms and the olive groves and the vines, and they did, year after year, but they could not take the great city itself. For Athens had built long walls all the way down to its harbour, so that it was joined to the sea like a fortress with one side always open to the water, and so long as Athens held the sea, and its ships could bring in grain from across the water, the city could not be starved out no matter how its fields were burned. And Athens, master of the sea, could sail around the coasts and raid wherever it pleased. But it could not, with its smaller army, meet the dreaded Spartans in open battle on land and hope to win. And so the war ground on, year after weary year, neither side able to land the killing blow. And the strategy of Pericles in the first years was exactly this: to yield the land, to bring all the people of the countryside inside the walls, to let the Spartans burn the empty fields, and to rely on the fleet and the sea and the grain ships, and simply outlast the enemy. It was a wise strategy, and it might have worked, but it reckoned without the one enemy that no wall can keep out. For with all the people of the countryside crowded inside the city walls, packed together in the heat far beyond what the city was built to hold, a terrible sickness broke out, a plague, and in those close and filthy and crowded conditions it spread like fire and killed without mercy. Killed the poor and the rich, the weak and the strong, killed by some reckonings a third or more of all the people of Athens, and among the countless dead it took. At last, Pericles himself, the great leader, the guiding mind, so that the city lost, in the middle of its greatest war, the one man who might have led it wisely through. And after him came lesser men, louder and greedier and rasher men, who flattered the people and inflamed them and led them into folly. And the war grew crueler as it went on, the way long wars do, both sides doing things in the later years that they would have been ashamed of at the start, massacring whole captured cities, killing the men and enslaving the women and children, until much of the old restraint and the old decency had been burned away. And the greatest folly of all came when the loud new leaders of Athens, not content with the war they already could not win, persuaded the people to gamble everything on a wild and glittering dream, to send a vast expedition, the greatest fleet and army the city had ever launched, all the way across the sea to the west, to the great and wealthy Greek island of Sicily, to conquer the powerful city of Syracuse and win an empire in the west that would make Athens unbeatable. It was a mad overreach, and a few wise voices warned against it, but the people were dazzled by the dream of it, and they voted to go, and they poured the flower of their strength, their finest ships, and their finest men into that far western adventure. and it ended in the most complete catastrophe in the whole history of the city. Everything went wrong. The great expedition, badly led and cursed with ill luck, laid siege to Syracuse and could not take it, and then found itself, the besieger, slowly becoming the besieged, trapped and surrounded far from home. And when at last the Athenians tried to escape, their fleet was defeated and bottled up in the harbour, and their army, trying to flee by land across the island, was hunted down and cut to pieces and forced to surrender, and the survivors, thousands upon thousands of them, the men who had sailed out so proudly in their gleaming ships, were herded into the stone quarries of Syracuse and left there. In the open, without shelter or enough food or water, in the burning sun and the cold nights, packed together among the dead and the dying, for weeks and months, until most of them had perished, and the few who lived were sold into slavery. The whole vast expedition, the ships, the men, the treasure, the hope, all of it was simply gone, swallowed up, and Athens reeled under the blow like a man struck over the heart, and yet, astonishingly, it did not give in. Even after that catastrophe, the tough and stubborn city fought on for years more, rebuilding its fleets, winning battles even, refusing to yield, so that you cannot help but admire the sheer unbreakable spirit of it, even as it staggers toward its doom. But it could not last forever. The end came at last upon the water, where Athens had always been strongest, for the Spartans, with new gold gotten in the final bitter irony, from the old enemy, from the great king of Persia, who was only too glad to pay the Greeks to destroy one another, at last built a fleet that could challenge the Athenians on the sea, and caught the last Athenian fleet unprepared on a beach, and destroyed it almost without a fight. And with its fleet gone, Athens was finished, for now its lifeline to the sea and to the grain ships was cut, and the city that could not be starved so long as it held the sea could be starved now, and was until, gaunt and beaten and hollow-eyed, the proud city that had defied the greatest empire on earth, that had built the Parthenon and given birth to philosophy and the theatre, surrendered at last to Sparta and its allies. The victorious enemies tore down the long walls that had joined the city to the sea, tore them down, it is said, to the music of flute girls, as though at a festival, believing that on that day the freedom of Greece was born again. They were wrong about that, as we shall see. But the great age of Athens was over, and the golden century that had begun in the glory of the war against Persia ended, 3 generations later, in the ruin of a war of Greek against Greek. The Spartans had promised freedom to the Greeks, but what they gave, once they had won, was a harsher and clumsier mastery than the one they had overthrown. For the Spartans, magnificent as soldiers, were hopeless as rulers of others. Their whole society, remember, was built for one thing only: the holding down of their own enslaved helots at home, and they had never learned, and could not learn, the softer arts of ruling free cities with any lightness of touch. And so, in city after city that they had freed from Athens, they installed narrow little governments of a few hard men friendly to Sparta, backed by a Spartan garrison, and these puppet governments ruled so cruelly, murdering and robbing their fellow citizens, that within a very few years the cities that had cheered the fall of Athens were groaning under Sparta and looking back on the Athenian empire almost with longing. And so the weary wars began all over again, alliances forming and dissolving, city turning against city. First this coalition rising against Sparta, and then that one, year after year, decade after decade, all of them bleeding one another, all of them growing weaker together, while far to the east the great king of Persia watched, and smiled, and paid now this side and now that, keeping the Greeks forever at one another's throats, forever too divided to trouble him, so that the empire the Greeks had defeated on the battlefield came, in the end, to rule the affairs of Greece from a distance, through gold, more surely than it could ever have ruled them by the spear. And in the midst of all this weary fighting there rose, for one brief and brilliant moment, a third city to challenge the 2 old giants, the city of Thebes, which under 2 remarkable leaders and a band of picked and famous warriors did the thing that everyone had believed impossible. It met the dreaded Spartans in open battle, phalanx against phalanx, spear against spear, and beat them. Beat them fairly and squarely on the open field, shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility that had stood for centuries, and then marched down into the very heartland of Sparta itself, where no enemy had come in living memory, and freed the enslaved helots of the West. The very people whose bondage had been the whole grim reason for the Spartan way of life, so that at a single stroke the foundation on which the whole of Sparta stood was knocked away, and Sparta, though it lingered on, was never a great power again. But Thebes could not hold its brief mastery either, for its greatness had rested on the genius of one or two men, and when they fell in battle its power fell with them. And so by now the pattern was plain and grim for anyone with eyes to see it. Every one of the great cities of Greece had had its turn at the top, and every one had been pulled down, and now they were all of them exhausted, all of them bled white, all of them so worn down by 100 years of fighting one another that not one of them had the strength any longer to master the rest, and yet none of them had the wisdom, or could ever swallow its pride enough, to stop and to unite, and to make of all the quarrelling cities one single Greece at last. And it was precisely at this moment, when the old cities of the south had exhausted themselves and one another into a kind of stalemate of weakness, that there rose, on the wild northern edge of the Greek world, in a rough half-barbarous kingdom that the polished southern Greeks had always looked down upon as hardly Greek at all, a new power and a new kind of power under one of the most brilliant and dangerous men of that or any age. The kingdom was Macedon, a land of mountains and horsemen and hard-drinking warrior nobles in the north, and its new king was named Philip, and the southern Greeks, in their pride, made the great mistake of underestimating him, for he was as clever and as patient and as ruthless a man as ever wore a crown. Philip had spent time as a young hostage in Thebes in the years of its greatness, and there he had learned at first hand the newest and finest arts of Greek warfare, and when he came to his own throne he took everything he had learned and made of it something new and terrible. He took the old Greek phalanx, the wall of shields and spears, and he lengthened the spears into pikes so long, 2 and 3 times the length of the old spears, that the men in the rear ranks could level their points out past the front rank, so that his phalanx bristled with a hedge of iron points many rows deep, a moving thicket of spears that no enemy could get near. And he joined to this deadly infantry the thing the flat horse-breeding plains of the north gave him in abundance, and the rocky south had always lacked, heavy cavalry, noble horsemen, who could smash into the flank of a broken enemy line and ride it down. And he drilled this army, winter and summer, year after year, until it was not a gathering of part-time citizen farmers who put down the plough for a season and picked it up again after the harvest, but the first truly professional standing army in the history of the Greek world, soldiers who did nothing but soldier, all year, every year, for pay, and who were, in consequence, better than anything the amateur citizen armies of the old cities could put against them. And having made this instrument, Philip used it, with a patience and a cunning that never showed its hand too soon, to make himself, step by step, year by year, city by city, the master of all Greece. He fought when he had to, and bribed when he could, for he used to say that no city wall was too high to be climbed by a donkey laden with gold, and he was a master of setting the Greek cities against one another, and coming in as the friend of one against another, and swallowing them both in the end. And in Athens, now long past its golden greatness, but still free, still proud, still ruling itself in its assembly, there rose one last great voice to see the danger clearly, and to cry out against it. The voice of the greatest orator the ancient world ever produced, a man named Demosthenes, who stood up in the assembly year after year and thundered against Philip, and begged and pleaded and scolded his fellow citizens to wake up, to see that this northern king meant to swallow their freedom, to stop their bickering and their comfortable pleasures and rouse themselves and unite with the other cities while there was still time to stop him. And his speeches were so great that they are studied still, after all these centuries, as the very summit of the art of persuasion. But great as they were, they came too late, and the cities roused themselves too slowly, and when at last Athens and Thebes and some others did unite and march out together to stop the northern king, they met his professional army on a plain called Chaeronea, and there, in one great battle, the freedom of the old Greek cities died. Philip's long pikes and his thundering cavalry, with his young son leading the decisive charge, broke the allied army utterly, and the day was lost, and with it the age-old independence of the cities, and from that day Greece, all of it, lay in the hand of the king of Macedon. Philip did not crush the beaten cities, for he was too clever for that. He treated them, on the whole, gently, and bound them into a great league under his own leadership, and then he announced to them the purpose for which he meant to use their united strength, a purpose grand enough, perhaps, to make even the loss of their freedom seem worth it. He would lead the Greeks, all of them together at last, no longer city against city, but shoulder to shoulder as one people, east, against the old enemy, against the great king of Persia, to avenge at last the burning of their temples a century and a half before, and to free the Greek cities of the east, and to win, out of the boundless wealth of the empire, a plunder beyond dreaming. It was the great dream of the age, this dream of a united Greek war of revenge against Persia, and Philip meant to lead it. But he never did. For at the very height of his power, with the great expedition all but ready to set out, at a festival in the middle of a great celebration, Philip was struck down and murdered by one of his own guards, for reasons that men have argued over ever since, and he fell dead, and left his throne, and his magnificent army, and his vast unfulfilled dream of the conquest of Persia, to his son, a young man of 20, the same young man who had led the charge that broke the Greeks at Chaeronea, a young man named Alexander, whom the world would come to call, before he was 30, the Great. There has never been anyone quite like Alexander, and it is worth slowing down here in the quiet and looking at him for a while, because his short and blazing life is one of the strangest and most astonishing stories that history has to tell. He was clever, for he had been tutored, as a boy, by none other than Aristotle himself, the widest mind of the age, so that the greatest conqueror of the ancient world was taught his letters and his philosophy by its greatest thinker, which is one of those coincidences of history almost too neat to be believed. He was brave to the very edge of madness, always the first into the battle and the last out of it, so that his body, by the end, was a map of scars from every kind of weapon. He was driven by a longing for glory and for the far horizon that nothing on this earth could ever satisfy, a restless yearning always to go further, to see what lay beyond the next mountain and the next river and the next desert, that drove him, in the end, quite literally to the ends of the earth, as the Greeks knew it. And he was young, always young, for he never grew old, never had the chance, but blazed across the whole known world like a comet, and was gone before he was 33. When his father was murdered and Alexander came to the throne, the Greek cities in the south, thinking the great king dead and only a green boy in his place, rose in revolt, hoping to win back their freedom. It was a fatal misjudgment. Alexander came down upon them with a speed that left them gaping, and when the city of Thebes, that ancient and glorious city, defied him, he took it by storm and made a terrible example of it, and razed the whole city to the ground, every house and every wall, sparing only the temples and, it is said, the house of one long-dead poet, and sold its whole surviving population into slavery, so that a city that had stood for 1,000 years, a city that had beaten Sparta and led Greece, simply ceased in a few days to exist, and the rest of Greece, appalled, fell silent and submitted, and did not rise again. And then, with Greece cowed behind him, Alexander turned east, and took up his dead father's dream, and crossed with his army into Asia, into the empire of the great king, to begin the most extraordinary campaign of conquest the world had ever seen. He had with him a small army, small at least beside the boundless manpower of the empire he was attacking, some tens of thousands of men, the superb professional army his father had built. and with it he proposed to overthrow an empire that stretched across half the world and could raise armies many times the size of his own. It should have been impossible. He did it anyway. Battle after battle, against odds that grew more absurd each time, he met the vast armies of the great king and shattered them. For his father's army was simply better than anything the empire could put in the field. And Alexander himself was a general of a genius that has rarely if ever been equalled, who saw in an instant, in the chaos and dust and terror of a battlefield, exactly where the enemy was weakest and exactly where to strike, and who struck, always himself, at the head of his cavalry, straight at the heart of the enemy, straight at the great king's own person. So that again and again the king, seeing this terrible young man come cutting through his guards straight toward him, lost his nerve and fled, and his fleeing broke his own army behind him. Alexander freed the Greek cities of the eastern coast, as his father had promised. He marched down the whole long coast of the Eastern Sea and into Egypt, where the ancient people, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator and hailed him as a god and a pharaoh, and where he founded, at the mouth of the great river, a new city and gave it his own name, Alexandria, a city that would grow. In the centuries after his death, into the greatest and most learned city of the whole ancient world. And then he turned back inland and marched into the very heart of the empire, and met the great king one last time, with the whole remaining strength of the East gathered against him, hundreds of thousands of men, and beat him one last time, and this time the king fled and did not stop, and was murdered soon after by his own despairing followers, and Alexander rode into the great capitals of the empire, into the palaces of the great kings, and sat upon the throne of the King of Kings, the master, now at 25, of the greatest empire the world had ever known, from the Greek Sea to the mountains of the East. But it was not enough for him. Nothing was ever enough for Alexander. Having conquered the greatest empire in the world, he did not stop and sit upon his throne and enjoy it, as any ordinary man would have done. He looked east, past the edge of everything the Greeks had ever known, toward the rising sun, and he wondered what lay out there, at the end of the world, for the Greeks believed that somewhere out in the far east the land ended, and the great encircling ocean that ringed the whole earth began, and Alexander conceived the desire to march to it, to the very edge of the world, and to look upon that ocean, and so to be the man who had conquered, quite literally, everything there was. And so he led his weary army on, east and ever east, over mountains and rivers and deserts, into lands the Greeks had never so much as heard of, into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan and the edge of India, fighting strange new enemies, war elephants and mountain kingdoms, marching for years through a world that grew stranger and stranger, further and further from home, until at last, at a river in the east, in the drenching rains of a season the Greeks had never known, his army stopped. They had followed him to the ends of the earth. They had marched, many of them, for 8 years and many thousands of miles, and won every battle, and they were old now, and scarred, and unimaginably far from the homes and the wives and the children they had left as young men. And when their restless king told them that beyond the next river lay yet more kingdoms to conquer, and beyond those yet more, and that he meant to go on and on, to the very edge of the world, they would not. For the first and only time in his life, his soldiers refused to follow, not in mutiny or anger, but in a kind of weary, immovable sorrow, and their old general spoke for them, and told the king, gently, that they had done enough, that they wished only to go home, to see their homeland again before they died. And Alexander raged, and sulked in his tent for days like the hero of the old poem he had loved as a boy, but in the end even he could not conquer the will of his own exhausted men, and he turned back. He never saw the edge of the world. He led his army home by a new and terrible road, partly, it seems, out of wounded pride, marching them through a burning desert where thousands died of thirst in the sand, and at last, after all those years and all those miles, he came back to the heart of his empire, to the great old city of Babylon, to rule at last the vast dominion he had won. And there at Babylon, still young, still restless, still dreaming of new conquests, of Arabia, of the West, of who knows what, he fell ill. Of a fever, or of poison, or of the sheer accumulated punishment of all those wounds and all those years and all that wine, and after some days of sickness in the summer heat of Babylon, Alexander died at the age of 32, having conquered the world and having, in the end, kept none of it, having built the largest empire the world had yet seen, and having neglected, in all his haste, to do the one thing that might have made it last, which was to arrange for what should happen after him. For he left no grown son, and no clear heir, and when, on his deathbed, his generals crowded around him and asked him, desperately, to whom he left his vast empire, he is said to have answered, with his last breath, only this, to the strongest. And so, the moment he was dead, his great empire, the work of all those battles and all those years, began to tear itself to pieces, as his generals, the hard ambitious men who had conquered the world at his side, turned upon one another and fought. For 40 years they fought, over the carcass of his empire, until at last the dust settled and the empire of Alexander had broken into several great kingdoms, each ruled by the descendants of one of his generals, a Greek kingdom in Egypt, a Greek kingdom across the vast east, a Greek kingdom in the old northern homeland of Macedon, and lesser Greek kingdoms besides. Alexander had failed, then, in the one thing, to found a lasting empire under his own house. And yet, in another and a deeper way, he had changed the world forever, more lastingly than almost anyone who ever lived. For in his short, furious blaze across the world he had carried the Greeks, and Greek soldiers and Greek traders and Greek settlers, and the Greek language, and Greek art, and Greek gods, and Greek ways of building and thinking and living, out of their small poor homeland and across the whole vast East, and had planted them there. In scores of new cities, many of them named, like the greatest, after himself, from Egypt to the mountains of the East. And so, in the centuries after his death, there came into being a whole new world, which we call the Hellenistic world, the world made Greek, a world in which, for 300 years, from Egypt to the borders of India, the language of learning and of trade and of government was Greek, in which a traveller could go into a city thousands of miles from Greece, a city of Egyptians or Persians or Bactrians, and find a Greek marketplace, and a Greek theatre, and a Greek gymnasium where the young men exercised, and hear the plays of Athens performed, and the poems of Homer recited, under a burning eastern sky, 10,000 miles and 1,000 years from the small stony land where it had all begun. The Greeks, who could never unite their own little homeland, had, through the sword of one restless young man, spread themselves and their whole way of seeing the world across half the earth. And though the young man himself was dead at 32 and his empire broken, that Greek-flavoured world he had made outlived him by centuries, and became the soil in which so much else would grow. Let us linger for a little while in that Hellenistic world, the world after Alexander, because although the old free cities were gone, and the age of Marathon and the Parthenon lay in the past, this was in its own way one of the most brilliant ages of the whole Greek story, an age of great kings and great libraries and, above all, of a flowering of science and learning such as the world would not see again for the better part of 2,000 years. And its heart, its shining centre, was the city that Alexander had founded at the mouth of the great Egyptian river, the city of Alexandria, which under the Greek kings of Egypt, the line of kings all named, one after another, some form of the name of Alexander's general who had founded the dynasty, grew into the largest and richest and most learned city in the whole world. Alexandria had a lighthouse, a tower of white stone on an island at its harbour mouth, taller than almost anything human beings had ever built, with a great fire burning at its summit through the night whose light, thrown out to sea by polished mirrors, could be seen, they said, from many miles away across the water, guiding the ships safely home, and it was reckoned one of the 7 wonders of the world. And Alexandria had something rarer and more precious even than its lighthouse. It had the library. For the Greek kings of Egypt, in their wealth and their love of learning, conceived an ambition beautiful in its madness, to gather into one place a copy of every book in the entire world, every scroll of every poem and every play, and every history and every treatise of medicine and mathematics and philosophy and astronomy that had ever been written in any tongue, and to bring them all together under one roof, and to gather, alongside the books, the finest scholars and thinkers and scientists of the age, and to house them and feed them and pay them and set them free to do nothing all their lives but read and think and argue and discover. It was the first great research institution in the history of the world, a whole community of scholars kept at the king's expense for the single purpose of increasing human knowledge, and gathered around the greatest collection of books that had ever existed, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated memory and wisdom of the entire known world. And the things that were discovered there in those bright centuries still take the breath away. For it was here, in this Greek world after Alexander, that human beings came closer to the modern understanding of the world than they would come again for many, many centuries. There was a scholar at Alexandria who set out to measure the size of the whole round earth, for the educated Greeks knew perfectly well that the earth was a sphere, having reasoned it out from the shape of its shadow on the moon and the way ships vanished hull first over the horizon. And this scholar, by measuring the angle of the shadow cast by the sun at noon, in 2 different cities are known, distance apart, and by some clever reasoning, calculated the distance around the whole earth and got an answer astonishingly close to the true figure, closer than anyone would come again for the better part of 2,000 years, and he did it with nothing but a stick, and a shadow, and the power of the human mind. There was another who argued that the earth was not the centre of everything, that it was the earth that moved around the sun, and not the sun around the earth, a truth so far ahead of its time that it was set aside and forgotten, and would not be firmly established for 1,800 years. There were mathematicians who wrote down the rules of geometry so perfectly and so completely that their textbook would go on being used, almost unchanged, to teach schoolchildren for more than 2,000 years, down almost to within living memory. There were engineers who built machines of gears and levers of astonishing cleverness, water clocks and toys that moved by steam and devices to calculate the movements of the stars and planets, so intricate that when, much later, a single such device was found in a shipwreck on the seabed, corroded into a green lump after 2,000 years underwater, and was at last understood, people could scarcely believe that the ancient world had built anything so complex. It was a golden age of the human mind, this Hellenistic age, and it is one of the quiet tragedies of history that so much of what it discovered was afterward lost, and had to be painfully rediscovered, sometimes only in the last few centuries, so that we cannot help but wonder how different the story of the world might have been if that bright flame of Greek science had not, in the end, guttered and gone so nearly out. But gutter it did, in time, for these Hellenistic kingdoms, for all their wealth and their learning, were not stable and not at peace. The successor kingdoms of Alexander's generals warred endlessly with one another, generation after generation, just as the old cities had, weakening one another, wearing one another down, and meanwhile, far away to the west, in Italy, in a city that in the great days of Athens had been nothing at all, a small and grim and hard-headed people had been rising, slowly and relentlessly, conquering first their neighbours, and then all of Italy, and then spreading out across the whole western sea, a people of few words and much discipline and boundless stubborn patience, a people who never seemed to know when they were beaten, and who simply came on, and on, until they had won. They were the Romans, and the Greek world, gazing westward from its ancient sunlit brilliance at these rough and warlike newcomers, made, at first, the very same mistake that the old cities had made about Philip of Macedon. It looked down on them and underestimated them, and did not see, until it was far too late, that here was the power that would swallow it whole. The Romans came into the Greek world at first, as conquerors so often do, by invitation, drawn in as the ally of one Greek power against another, for the Greeks. Unable to stop fighting one another even now, at the very edge of the abyss, called in the Romans to help them against their Greek rivals, exactly as they had once called in the gold of Persia, never learning, it seems, the oldest lesson of all, that the mighty stranger you invite in to help you against your neighbour will, in the end, stay to rule you both. And the Romans came, and they fought the Greek kingdoms one by one. And they beat them one by one, for the Roman legion, that hard, flexible fighting machine of short swords and heavy javelins and iron discipline, proved, on field after field, more than a match even for the long pikes of the Macedonian phalanx, which was terrible so long as it kept its perfect order on level ground, but which the nimbler Romans learned to break apart on the broken ground, where its long, unwieldy pikes became a hindrance rather than a wall. And so, kingdom by kingdom and war by war, over the course of a century or so, the Romans conquered the Greek world, the old homeland first, then the kingdoms of the East one after another. There was a moment, near the beginning, when the Romans, having beaten the king of Macedon, actually proclaimed at the great games, before the assembled Greeks, that the cities of Greece were to be free and ungoverned and subject to no one, and the Greeks, hearing it, are said to have wept and cheered so wildly, so overcome with joy at the word freedom, that birds flying overhead fell stunned from the sky at the roar of it. But it was a hollow freedom, a freedom on Rome's sufferance, and it did not last, for the Greeks would not stop their quarrelling and their revolts, and Rome's patience, never deep, at last ran out. And the end, when it came, was written in fire at the old and wealthy Greek city of Corinth, which had defied Rome one time too many. For the Romans, to teach the Greeks a lesson they would never forget, did to Corinth what Alexander had done to Thebes, and what Rome itself would later do to its great rival across the Western Sea. They took the city, and they killed or enslaved its people, and they stripped it of its treasures, and they burned it, and razed it to the ground, and left the site of one of the great cities of Greece an empty and blackened ruin, as a message written in ash to every other Greek who might dream of defying Rome. And with the destruction of Corinth, the independence of old Greece was finished for good, and Greece became, simply, a province of Rome, a conquered land, governed by Roman officials, taxed for Rome's benefit. Its long, turbulent history of free and quarrelling cities over at last. And one by one, in the years and the decades that followed, the last of the great Greek kingdoms of the East fell too, until only one remained, the oldest and richest and proudest of them all, the Greek kingdom of Egypt, ruled still from Alexandria by the line of Alexander's general. And its last ruler was the most famous of all that line, a queen as clever and as charming and as ruthless as any of her ancestors, the last Greek ruler of the ancient world, the queen whose name still means, to us, all the glamour and the doom of the dying ancient world, Cleopatra. She was not Egyptian by blood, though she ruled Egypt and was the first of all her Greek line even to trouble to. Learn the Egyptian tongue. She was Greek, a descendant of Alexander's Macedonian general, the very last inheritor of the world that Alexander had made. And she was clever enough to see that the only hope of saving her ancient kingdom from being swallowed, like all the rest, by Rome, was to bind herself to the most powerful men of Rome itself, and this she did. First to the greatest Roman of one generation, and then to a leading Roman of the next, winning them, dazzling them, bearing their children, and nearly, very nearly through them, keeping her kingdom free. But she had bound her fortune to the losing side in Rome's own great civil wars, and when her Roman lover was defeated, at a great sea battle fought, as it happened, off the coast of Greece. And Rome's victor came for Egypt. She saw that all was lost, that her kingdom would fall, and she herself would be dragged to Rome, to be led in chains through the streets as a trophy of the conqueror's triumph. And rather than suffer that, she chose to die, by her own hand, in her palace at Alexandria, a queen to the last. And with her death, the last Greek kingdom passed into the hand of Rome, and Egypt too became a Roman province. And the long, long age that had begun, more than 1,000 years before, with the first Greek-speaking clerks counting sheep on their clay tablets in the fortress of Mycenae, came, at last, quietly, to its close. The Greeks, as a free and independent people making their own history, were finished. The whole of their world, from the old homeland to the last kingdom of the East, lay now under the eagles of Rome. And yet, and here is the last and gentlest turn of the whole long story, the one that I want to leave you with as the night grows deep. The Greeks did not really lose, not in the way that mattered most. For something very strange happened between the Greeks and the Romans, something that has happened only rarely in all of history. And it is this: the conquered conquered the conquerors. The Romans had beaten the Greeks on every battlefield. They had burned Corinth and swallowed the kingdoms and made the whole Greek world their province. They ruled the Greeks utterly, in body. But in mind and in spirit, it was the other way around. For the rough and practical Romans, coming into contact with the older and subtler and more beautiful civilization of the Greeks, fell, quite simply, in love with it, and set themselves to learn everything the Greeks could teach. A Roman poet, looking back, put it in a single unforgettable line that captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror, and it was true. The Romans took the Greek gods and made them their own, giving them Roman names but keeping the Greek stories. They took Greek art and copied it and filled Rome with Greek statues and Greek paintings and hired Greek artists, so that much of what we know of Greek art survives only in the Roman copies of it. They took Greek architecture, the columns and the temples, and built with it all across their empire. They sent their sons to Greece, to Athens, to study philosophy in the very city of Socrates and Plato, so that Athens, its days of power a distant memory, lived on for centuries as the beloved university of the whole Roman world, a quiet town of schools and old glories where the young men of the empire came to learn to think. They took Greek philosophy into their very souls, so that the noblest of the Romans, even an emperor upon his throne, wrote his most private meditations on how to live a good life not in his own Latin tongue, but in Greek, the language of wisdom. The educated Roman spoke Greek as naturally as his own language. Greek doctors healed him, Greek tutors taught his children, Greek poets and Greek plays and Greek ideas filled his mind. And so through Rome, and Rome's vast and lasting empire, the mind of Greece was carried onward and outward across the whole of Europe and far beyond, long after the Greeks themselves had ceased to rule anything at all, and when, in the fullness of time, Rome itself at last declined and fell, and the Western world went down into its own long centuries of darkness, much of the learning of the Greeks was lost in the West, the books mouldering away, the Greek tongue forgotten, the great discoveries of Alexandria dropping out of memory. But it was not lost everywhere. In the East, in the Greek-speaking half of the Roman world, which endured for another 1,000 years after the western half had fallen, the old books were copied and kept and treasured. And among the scholars of the great civilization of the East that rose in those centuries, the Greek works of philosophy and medicine and mathematics and astronomy were gathered up, and translated, and studied, and built upon, and preserved through the long ages when the West had forgotten them. And then, at last, slowly, over centuries, that preserved Greek learning came flooding back into the West, translated and retranslated, passed from hand to hand and tongue to tongue, until it helped to kindle, in the cities of a reawakening Europe, that great rebirth of art and learning and inquiry that we call, in the very word, the rebirth, when the men and women of a new age rediscovered the Greeks, and read Plato and Aristotle again with wonder, and gazed at the ruins of the Parthenon, and tried to build as beautifully, and took up again the old Greek questions about the world and how it works and how we ought to live, and set out, once more, upon the long road of inquiry that the Greeks had first opened, and that leads, in a line you can very nearly trace, all the way down to us. For it is truly astonishing, when you stop and think of it in the stillness of the night, how much of what fills your own life, right now, came first from those quarrelling little cities on that stony sunlit shore. When people vote, and count the raised hands and let the majority decide, that is a Greek idea born on a bare hillside in Athens. When a scientist supposes that the world runs by understandable laws and sets out to find them, that is a Greek idea, born among the lonely thinkers of the eastern coast. When a student learns geometry, the very shapes and proofs are Greek, set down at Alexandria and passed down unbroken for 2,000 years. When we go to the theatre and sit in the dark and watch a story of human beings brought to ruin or to joy, and feel our own hearts moved and cleansed by it, that is a Greek invention, born on the slope beneath the sacred rock. The very word for so much of our highest life is Greek. Democracy is a Greek word, and philosophy and history and physics and mathematics and drama and comedy and tragedy and music and theatre and atom and so many more, each one a little coin of thought first minted by the Greeks and still passing, worn smooth by use from hand to hand among us, so that we cannot even talk about our deepest concerns without, at every turn, speaking Greek without knowing it. They were not saints, the Greeks. We must not leave them wrapped in a golden haze, for that would be to turn them, as the herdsman turned the palace at Knossos, into a legend and lose the truth of them. They kept slaves, great numbers of them, and thought it natural, and built their leisure and their glory upon that unfree labour. They shut their women away from public life and gave them little freedom and less voice. They could be cruel in war beyond anything we would forgive, massacring whole cities, killing the men and selling the children. They were vain and quarrelsome, and could never, for all their genius, learn to live at peace with one another, and in the end it was that endless quarrelling, that fatal inability to unite, that laid them open to Macedon and then to Rome and cost them, in the end, their freedom. They were, in short, human, as fully and as flawed and as contradictory as we are ourselves, capable of the Parthenon and of the massacre in the same lifetime, of the philosophy of Socrates and of the poison that killed him. But that, in the end, is what makes them so precious to us, and so near across all those thousands of years, for they were the first people in the Western world to look at themselves and their world clearly, without flinching, and to ask the great questions out loud, and to write down what they saw, the glory and the shame together, and to hand it all on to us. And now the story has come round again, at the very end, to where it began, on the shore by the sea. For that stony land is still there, the sea still breathes against those pale shores exactly as it did before there was a single Greek to hear it, and exactly as it will long after all of us are gone. The olive trees still turn their leaves to silver in the evening wind on the dry hills. The broken white columns of the temple still stand upon the sacred rock above the city, gold in the last of the light, as the sun goes down over the same sea that carried the black ships to Troy, and carried the grain to besieged Athens, and carried the fleets to Salamis, and carried Alexander east to the ends of the earth. The people who quarrelled and sailed and built and dreamed upon those shores are 3,000 years gone, turned long ago to dust and olive shade, their voices silent, their fierce little cities fallen into quiet ruins where the lizards sun themselves on the warm old stones and the wildflowers grow up between the fallen columns. And yet they are not really gone at all, for we carry them within us, in the words we speak and the way we think and the very shape of the questions we ask, every single day, without ever once stopping to remember where any of it came from. History does not disappear. It only sinks down, quietly, out of sight, and becomes the ground beneath our feet. The soil we stand on without ever looking down, the deep foundation of everything we build. And the Greeks are, more than almost any other people who ever lived, that ground beneath our feet. So let them rest now, in the warm dark of the past, in the shade of their olive trees, on the shore of their patient sea, their long and turbulent and brilliant day over at last, their gifts handed on and safe with us. And let yourself rest too, for it is very late now, and you have come with me all the long way from the first small fires on the ancient shore. through the palaces and the wars and the golden years and the far conquests, all the way down to the quiet ruins and the setting sun, and there is nowhere further to go tonight, and nothing more you need to do, and nowhere at all you need to be, but here, warm and still, and safe in the gentle dark. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to be, not any longer. The story is told, and the sea is quiet, and the lamp has burned low, and everything that needed to happen has already happened, long, long ago, and been carried safely home. If you have enjoyed this long walk through the old world, you might, another night, let me tell you another such story. And there is one waiting for you now, just there, on the screen, whenever you wish it. Another gentle road through the past to carry you off to sleep. And if these quiet journeys are a comfort to you, you might quietly subscribe, but only if they truly are, so that other souls lying awake in the dark might find their way here too, and rest as you are resting now. But do not trouble yourself with any of that tonight. Tonight there is nothing left to do at all, so let the lamp grow dim, let the last of the day slip away, let the sea grow quiet, and the old shore grow dark, and the whole long story soften and fade and fall away into the deep and gentle silence out of which it came. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders grow heavy, and your eyes grow heavy, and let go, now, of everything, and sink down softly into rest. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.